Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be going over Unit 1 for AP Comparative Government and Politics. So, essentially, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go through each of the course exam description topics for this unit, and every unit actually. This is just the starting point. We'll go through each of them individually, and I'm trying to go at a pretty in-depth level to really help discuss the concepts and the examples, because this course covers 6 different countries, which is a decent amount to cover in such a short amount of time. So I'm really excited about this. I put a decent amount of work and research into these PowerPoints, and I'm hoping to share a lot of information with you to help you for your class, as well as that AP exam. May the luck be in your favor. I don't know if that's how it goes. May the odds be in your favor, or something like that. Anyways, I do want to emphasize that I have resources available for you. You can have guided notes to follow along with the lecture. There's also some practice tests as well that I've created. They're a little long. The MCQ test is like 68 questions, and that's just for this unit. That's longer than the AP exams, multiple choice sections, but that just goes to show how much you need to know from this unit. And then the FRQ test, those are 4 FRQs, and they cover a good range of topics as well. And then I have a key terms lists. They're just an empty set of key terms for you. You can go out, find definitions, examples, graphs, pictures, whatever you want. It just gives you a basis of specific vocab that you need to know. I also do want to emphasize the course and exam description. So this is a document created by the College Board. And this document is very important because it tells you what's on the AP exam. If it's not in this course and exam description, you don't really need to know it. So one thing that teachers really like to emphasize in this class is the history of the 6 countries, particularly from maybe the mid-1800s to now. And some of that history is kind of important because it impacts the political systems today. But a lot of it, and most of it, is not necessary to succeed in this class and understand what we have to learn. So I will teach you any history that you need to know and that is detrimental to learning this content. And this document also goes over how the FRQs are structured, how the multiple choice is structured. It goes over the different skills you have to know, because not only do you have to learn specific content, which they do a very good job of outlining, you also have to learn different skills on how to apply and explain and compare this content. And they give you a brief overview of what those skills are and when you will need to apply them. It's very, very helpful. It's a little long, but it's definitely helpful in understanding what you need to know for this class. So let's get started here with 1.1, Comparative Government, the systematic study and comparison of diverse political systems in the world. You don't have to memorize that, but that's just a very, 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 very short definition of comparative government. So essentially, we are comparing political systems. Political systems are not uniform in nature. They have different functions depending on what systems you're looking at. Even within a country, you have your local systems and you have your federal systems. Like, let's take the United States, for example. You have your county governments, which also have your state governments, and then you have your federal governments. And the United States is part of a variety of international organizations as well that have their own systems and their own political impacts on our country. Now, this course doesn't emphasize anything in the United States. You will not be asked about the United States at all. So that's pretty much the last American analogy I'll probably give. You're welcome. So we're going to be looking at 6 different political systems that are present in the world. We're looking at Iran, which I may say Iran, Iran, it really doesn't matter. Russia, United Kingdom, Nigeria, Mexico, and China. They're all very different, but they also have some similarities to them, and we're going to look at all of them. So first we got to look at measuring different measurements, different units that political scientists often utilize. So the first one is HDI scores. And this is a map at a global scale because we're looking at the globe. And it's displaying the Human Development Index scores. That's what HDI stands for, Human Development Index. And it's displaying them by a country basis or a country scale of analysis. So this score is considered empirical data. Now, what does that mean, empirical data? Well, I don't have a key here, which is really bad on my part, but the key would show that different shades represents different physical quantities, different numbers, because HDI is not a ranking. It's not ranked on 1 to 100. They do rank countries, but they rank the countries based off of a actual score, an actual number, a measurement. So what does that have to do with empirical data per se? Well, empirical data is information that is based off of, you could say, experimentation. It's very factual. It's objective. It's numerical. Sometimes it may be normative data, which we'll get into. That's numerical. But this is mostly your statistics. So if you're given a percentage, for example, the like percentage of people that have a bachelor's degree in a country, that's empirical data. And that can be done through surveying, or that can be done by actually polling every single person in a country. So in a lot of countries, they conduct a census for population. That's empirical data. HDI scores is a great example of empirical data. Empirical information is used very commonly by political scientists to apply concepts, support generalizations, and make arguments. Arguments and conclusions in political scientists often center on relationships between variables. We're looking at that in just a second. So these are our three variables that impact an HDI score. This is it. So we have knowledge. So we're really looking at education rates. We're not looking at, let's say, literacy rates. That's maybe something that you'll see maybe on the multiple choice section of the exam to try to trick you up. But knowledge, education rates, those are the two ways to say it, as well as healthcare and standard of living. Healthcare impacts your life expectancy, and standard of living is a sign of that economic development. Obviously, countries with higher economic development are going to have a higher standard of living because they can afford those delicacies, and what makes a higher standard of living a higher, wealthier standard of living. So United Kingdom is obviously going to have a higher standard of living than Nigeria. I mean, look at it. United Kingdom is very dark green, which means a higher HDI score. In Nigeria, it's orange. It's not red like other countries like Mali, but Mali, I don't know. I don't care. And it's definitely not as dark as United Kingdom, and it's not as green as China or Mexico. China and Mexico are lime green, which demonstrates very similar levels of HDI scores. Now, they're not exact, but they are very similar. They're certainly better than that of Nigeria. And now Iran. Now, which one's Iran? A lot of students mix this up. So I'm actually going to pull out the PowerPoint laser pointer, which is really cool. Here you go. You see it? This is Iran, whatever you want to call it, right here. That's our focus for this course. And that's also lime green. So that demonstrates a relatively similar HDI score to China and Mexico. Now, what was our last country? Russia. This one right here. It's darker than China and Iran and Mexico, but it's not as dark as United Kingdom. So that means that Russia has a higher HDI score than these three countries and Nigeria, but a lower HDI score than the United Kingdom. So we can conclude that Russia is not as developed. So let's get rid of that laser pointer. All right, here's some more information. You might see something like this on the AP exam. You'll see surveying, or you might get an article with a lot of statistics. So like, they surveyed this many people about this subject that's happening in this country. And they'll give you like 3 questions related to that. Those are typically easier questions. We got to be able to read these types of graphs and all that fun stuff. Your FRQ number 2 has a question where you have to read a graph or a table like this and answer questions just based off reading the graph. So it's not even going to ask you, like, they will ask you like relations to AP content, but there are going to be questions simply on reading a graph, and those are supposed to be freebie. So we're going to get some practice in with reading graphs. That's literally the first thing we're doing. So this is, how do people in China view America? And just a bunch of information here. It's probably It's probably formulated by polling. And it's another example of empirical data. It's very, very sharp statistics. It's objective. Yeah. It's also quantitative data, and I didn't discuss this on the last slide. So what is quantitative data? Well, do you see this prefix quantitate? quantit, as however you want to say it. That means numerical. It means a number. So we have, let's see, you have an unfavorable opinion in the United States. 45.4% agree. That's a quantity. That's what makes this quantitative data. The other one that you need to know is qualitative data. And I'm emphasizing the qual prefix of it, qualitative. That stands for quality. And that's really anything that doesn't have anything to do with numbers. So you ask someone, do you like the United States? And they say no. That's qualitative. No numerical value in that. If I ask someone what their favorite country is and they say Russia for whatever reason, that's qualitative data. Now, if you ask them, if you don't ask, but if you actually, you could ask. If you poll 100 people and you ask them if they like the United Kingdom or Russia better, and you get a response that's 80 people prefer the United Kingdom, that's quantitative data because that 80 is a numerical value. Now we'll look at a different value, graduation rates in Nigeria. So this is more empirical data, very objective, very factual. It's not really a value statement. It's not based off of opinions or beliefs, which is like your normative data. It's also more quantitative data. We're dealing with numbers as well. And I do want to emphasize the trend that we see here. So what's the trend that we can conclude based off this graph? We can conclude that graduation rates in Nigeria are growing. That is our conclusion that we have drawn. It really started growing in about 2005, 2006, 2007-ish, and it's continued to grow up until 2014. And I could probably have given you a more updated graph, but I didn't. You just gotta work with that. College Board, typically in the AP exam, doesn't cover anything within the past 5 years. So if there's been a big event like Russia and Ukraine, you probably won't see on the AP exam quite yet. They're just now probably starting to put Brexit on there. And if you don't know what that is, it's the United Kingdom withdrawal from the European Union, which we'll cover a good bit. Even in this unit, we'll discuss. So what are graduation rates increasing? And that's not what I was supposed to say. Where's my pen? It's supposed to say why are graduation rates increasing. So why are graduation rates increasing? Well, Jerry Seinfeld over here says, because of government spending or roosters. Is he right? He's wrong. Well, he could be wrong. We don't really know. It's very hard for a political scientist to find causation. And causation deals with cause and effect. So it's very hard for political scientists to conclude that graduation rates are increasing because of government spending. Could they be increasing because there's better teachers, or because of the change in the student to staff ratio, or the development of schools, or changes in the curriculum, or maybe these students have parents that motivate them more, or maybe their environments are more motivating or successful, or more makes them more prone to success, or has less distractions, maybe access to the internet or advanced communication and transportation technologies impacts their success rate. There's so many factors that it's very hard for political scientists to pinpoint a single one. Roosters, on the other hand, and sometimes there could be factors that do impact graduation rates, but are very, very unique, a little out of pocket, or they may impact them in a very, very small amounts. So we could say there's correlation between government spending and graduation rates. If we saw a graph that showed government spending was increasing, that's correlation. That's called positive correlation because they're both increasing. But we can't conclude right off the bat that increased government spending increases graduation rates in Nigeria. We could even say that they increase graduation rates in Mexico, but that doesn't mean they increase in Nigeria because they have different tax systems in both countries that impact their government spending. And this writing here, I didn't plan on this writing being here, but this comes down to this little hint of knowledge for you. Correlation does not mean causation. That's something straight out of the course and exam description. You'll hear this in other courses. If you take AP Psychology, you'll hear this. Correlation does not mean causation. Just because there's a correlation doesn't mean that they cause one another. All right, here's another value that you need to be familiar with. Gross domestic product. Now, you don't have to memorize these values, and if you ever take a class in college that asks you to memorize these values, please drop it. These are your values. And you should kind of be familiar that the United Kingdom has the highest GDP. And you should be familiar that Iran has the lowest GDP. And that Nigeria is kind of around Iran. And then Mexico, China, Russia are pretty similar. You want to know that China has a GDP of what's it called? 1,773 billion dollars. And this is in US dollars. So there's 4 factors that impact your gross domestic product, consumption, investments, your net exports, which is your expenditures, and government spending in a country. We're just talking about government spending. So all of these happen within a country, within the borders. So GDP is the sum of all the spending of the goods and services within a country. So this is empirical data. It's a big piece of factual statistics. There's also quantitative data because it's dealing with quantities. And we also have GDP per capita, which is also something the College for wants you to know. GDP per capita is just the GDP divided by the population. They're probably not going to ask that. They're probably going to give you a graph and ask you a bunch of random stuff about it. And as you can see here, the countries with the higher GDPs have the higher GDP per capita. So that's very interesting to know. That is correlation. Then we have our GDP growth rate. We can also see here that countries with the higher GDPs have higher GDP growth rates, which is also very interesting as well. I mean, look at Nigeria and Iran. They have very low GDP growth rate. Mexico and Iran have the same GDP growth rate, but Mexico's GDP is 4 times as high. Their GDP per capita is 2.5 times as high. So there's definitely some factors impacting their existing GDP, as well as what's happening in the country to change what their GDP is. And in the last unit, we'll discuss political economics, and we'll look at all this some more. So what conclusions can we draw? Well, the UK is the most economically successful. We could probably draw this conclusion just because they have the highest GDP per capita and the highest GDP. Now, China has the highest GDP growth rate, and that's because they're industrializing still to an extent. They've been industrializing forever. The United Kingdom is mostly a service-based economy. China's getting there, though, especially with the capitalist measures that have been taken there recently. But their success certainly isn't as high as the United Kingdom because their GDP and GDP per capita aren't as high yet, despite that high growth rate. They're getting there, though. They certainly are. Now, what else can we draw? China and Russia have similar labor forces because they have high GDP per capita. We can't conclude that. Again, correlation and causation. We can't say that, oh, China and Russia, they have very similar labor forces. No, we could say that maybe wages in the United Kingdom are lower, so they have less money to spend on consumption. We could possibly conclude that, or that could just be something we have to consider in our conclusions, in our analyzation and generalizations and conclusions. Yeah. China could have increased government spending because they have higher taxes. Now, that would also impact your consumption and investment, but we can just forget about that. This is not an economics course. But again, there's so many factors that impact GDP. I mean, we already have these 4 basic ones, and there's so many little factors like business cycles that impact our GDP, that impact our economic growth and our consumption and our investments. Real estate falls under the investment side of GDP, and there's so many little factors like your interest rates and your market size and demand for housing and your types of housing. If you have more apartments and single family homes, how's that going to impact your investment patterns? And those will vary between countries, as well as, your taxes and your trade, because net exports deals with trade. It's imports minus exports. So there's just so much stuff going on. All right, so this is the Gini index. Some people say Gini index. I believe it is the Gini index. And this measures income inequality. So it's another economic measurement. It's more quantitative data because we're dealing with specific numbers here. And this one I gave a key for. You're very, very welcome for this. So the higher the Gini coefficient value, the more income inequality there is. And that's something you have to know. Because they may ask you on the AP exam, what is a higher Gini coefficient value? I mean, they're probably not going to ask you that. They'll ask you to apply it. But you do need to know that a higher value means higher inequality, which means disparity, differences, incomparable. So we can see here that our our least developed countries, I'm looking at really Iran and Nigeria, have higher means of income inequality, while our more developed countries like Mexico, China, and the United Kingdom, Russia, they have lower levels of income inequality. They're really relatively similar to one another. China, and Mexico have higher inequality than the United Kingdom, but still very similar to one another. Okay, so this is the Fragile States Index. This is also called the Failed States Index. And a failed state is essentially where the government cannot respond to the needs of the people. They cannot respond to maybe domestic or international violence. They are a failed state. They're not serving their purpose as a government anymore. So the country with the highest... Where's Failed States Index? I'm trying to find like the specific values because I didn't provide that to you. So the country with the exact highest on our 6 countries list is Nigeria, and in 2018 it was 99.9. And then our lowest was the United Kingdom, which we can see here. It's very green at 34.3, and it's basically ranking the governmental organizations based off their potential to weaken due to conflicts and domestic turmoil. It has 12 different indicators. They're grouped as like cohesion indicators, economic indicators, political indicators, and then cross-cutting indicators. So yeah, and this really allows for a more in-depth analysis and comparison of our core countries and how their political systems are working. And if there's conflict that they need to resolve that they can't resolve, or their conflict is so severe. In Nigeria, there's a big problem with terrorism, with Muslim terrorism in the north. In Mexico, there's drug cartels. And then in China, well, China's government itself is very corrupt. Communism. So that's just something to consider. A lot of factors that impact this. This isn't something that the AP course really likes to talk about that much, but it's something you need to know. All right, what does Jerry have to say? Greater GDP makes states less fragile. That is wrong. That's more causation. We're not looking at causation here. Yes, maybe we can establish some correlation here that higher GDP is correlated with lower scores on our fragile states index. Because a lower score, that's something you have to know, a lower score on this failed states index indicates that they're less likely to be a failed state. They're less fragile, essentially. So that's correlation we can draw, but we can't conclude that, if we have more GDP, we're going to lower our fragile states index. No, there's so much more that goes into that. And not every aspect of GDP will impact your potential of the government to even do its job. I mean, government spending is part of them, but so is consumption in our GDP, and that's consumer consumption. So me going to the grocery store and buying milk, that's consumption. What does that have to do with how the government functions? It can respond to domestic turmoil. It really doesn't. All right, this is the Freedom Index. I think it's called Freedom House, Freedom International. You may see any of those 3 terms. This is very up to date. Doesn't go up to 2014 or 2018. And again, here we can see that our least developed countries have lower freedom. So our most free country, United Kingdom, I believe our least free country is China, under that communist republic. That's what it's called. The People's Republic of China is the official toponym for China. Let's make some comparisons here between our failed states index and the Freedom House. So there's correlation here. Like I said, a lower score on our fragile states index, our lower, development as well, indicates a higher score of the Freedom International. So countries that are most free typically are less fragile politically. So that is correlation. All right, and this is the Corruption Perceptions Index. And this is 2019. My data here is from 2017. But it's relatively similar. So the Corruption Perceptions Index essentially allows us to assess and rank the perception of corruption in different countries. So basically, which country has the most corruption? And we can see here that Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, Iran have the most corruption out of our 6 countries. United Kingdom with the lowest, and then China's kind of in between there, which is very interesting to say the least. I know, we have so much different measurements. I think this is the last one, though. So, you're welcome for that. If you want to do more, if you want to look at more, there's certainly more you could look at. You could look at gross national product, growth rate. There's, oh my gosh, there's so much that you could look at. If you want to compare these countries and how they're doing, you can literally look at look at graduation rates. That one I showed you was just us practicing reading graphs, but you can definitely look at literacy rates, graduation rates. You can look at just imports and exports. You could look at the size of their military or military spending. I think that falls under, it's called defense spending, if you want to look up the official term for that. So yeah, now what could cause all this corruption in the countries? Well, we're going to cover that. In Mexico, drug cartels is a big one. Nigeria, terrorist corruption. In the north, they have federalism in Nigeria, so there's federal governments that are particularly Muslim that have seen levels of corruption. Their electoral system isn't perfect, which we'll explain. Russia's under one-party dominance, not in the sense that there's only one party ruling Russia, like there is in China, but there's really one party that's running the whole country, and we'll go over that later. Okay, so we just went through in the last section different measurements that political scientists use, and now we're really going to get into the good stuff of political science. We're really going to look at political systems, states, governments, regimes, nations, and we're really going to dive into some specifics of our course countries. So our first vocab term is political systems. So these comprise of the laws, the ideas, and procedures that address who should have the authority to rule, so who are our rulers, who are our representatives, and what the government's influence on its people and economy should be. So what say does the government have in its economy? Can it nationalize corporations? Can it take taxes from corporations? Can it have sales taxes, for example? What's the influence on the people? Can they tax the people with a federal income tax or a property tax? Can they provide free speech? Will they have judicial systems that will protect civil rights and civil liberties? Will they provide public infrastructure for the people, like roads and bridges? There's so many different influences that governments can have, and these vary per country as well, and vary at various levels too. And these change over time, particularly like spending. Maybe the governments will choose to spend more on education as there's more children being born in a country. Nigeria is growing very much so in their population, so education should be a pretty big focus in the country. So, in the United Kingdom, there is a king. King Charlie is the king of the United Kingdom. So, their political system has what's called a monarchy. And then in Mexico, their political system has presidential elections. They have a president. And then the people can elect a president through a electoral system. Here I have the results if you're interested. And then China has a very communist political system. Now, let's look at countries. Now, in this class, in AP Human Geography, we call countries states, but they mean the same thing, okay? They have various characteristics, like defined borders. They have to start and end somewhere, a permanent population, so people can't just move in there, live there for 5 years, and move out. They have to have sovereignty over their internal processes and foreign policy. They also have to have recognition as a state by other states. So if they have these 3 characteristics, they'll have recognition as a state for the most part. Now, that sovereignty part's pretty important. So we're going to look at an example later. But essentially, that means that they can't have a government telling them what to do. So Canada can't tell Mexico that they have to have a sales tax of 7%. They can't tell them that. And Mexico can't just go with it because Canada tells it to. Mexico, if they wanted to set a sales tax, they could do it themselves over maybe what the people want or just what they want to set. And then again, they can have control over their foreign policy and who they have relations with. That's up to them. They don't have to do anything that's told by their external countries, these external powers. So Russia is an example of a country, a state. So is Mexico and the United Kingdom and Nigeria and Iran and China and Belgium and the Netherlands and Mongolia and Sri Lanka and India and Australia. All right, let's look at China's territory, for example. That's Taiwan. Is Taiwan a country? Jerry Seinfeld says yes. George says it's wrong. Because in AP world and in the United Nations and a lot of other people around the world, Taiwan is not a country because it lacks certain characteristics that countries have. I literally looked up Chinese territory for a graph, and this website had Taiwan listed as part of China's territory. China itself is a country. You can't have a country that's a part of another country. That literally doesn't make any sense. So it lacks recognition pretty much because it lacks sovereignty. So sovereignty, as I discussed pretty much earlier, is that it has to have dominant political authority and control over their internal processes and foreign policy. And this is exercised by a government over its territory and its people. So if something has sovereignty over territory, that territory doesn't have its own sovereignty. That's different. It may have some kind of powers that it can rule over the air, like local governments have local laws, but it does have full sovereignty that's without influence and control of a bigger body. So Taiwan's under influence and control essentially under China, which is a bigger body. So it's not its own country. So the United Nations doesn't recognize it as a sovereign country, a sovereign state, because of this. And China is also on the UN board, and it doesn't say it's a country, so can't really make it a country without China's approval on the United Nations. So what's the role of a state? What does a state do? Why do we have states? Well, they create and implement public policy, and they claim a monopoly of force over a defined territory. So in AP Human, you might have learned of territoriality. That's essentially what this is. So they defend their territory. They claim what happens in the territory. They also what's it called? I said defend, but they also regulate what happens in that territory as well. What political, economic, social, cultural processes happen, what environmental processes happen inside a territory. And they create policy to regulate this, and they enforce that policy so they don't have anarchy. So let's look at an example here in Nigeria. So Nigeria collects taxes like pretty much every other country in the world. And they collect them through income taxes, property taxes, capital gains taxes, stamp duties, road taxes. There's many more that I didn't list. These are just examples. And then the state of Nigeria uses these taxes for public programs like infrastructure and defense, which is their military, educational facilities, paying public services like the police officers in the police force, as well as the water supply, because water is a public service in pretty much every country in the world, like Nigeria. So that's a role of the many roles that Nigeria has. Now let's talk about regimes. Regimes. I love saying regimes. It's really fun to say. So regimes refer to the fundamental rules that control access to and the exercise of political power. So it's characterized as democratic or authoritarian, and they endure from government to government. So if you change a government, the regime typically stays. It endures. So it's the way that the state is organized, and it's a pattern of organization. And we're going to look at how this pattern works and is set up. So as I said earlier, they are either democratic or authoritarian, and this is based on who exercises political power, as well as how they exercise political power. And one thing that we'll focus on in this course a lot is elections. So a democratic regime has free, fair, competitive elections, while authoritarian regimes do not. So we can see here we have some cool little ballot collection. I think this is in the United Kingdom, and the other one is definitely China. And the people with political power is the Communist Party, while people in the United Kingdom elect who has political power. While for the most part, in China, that doesn't really happen at the federal level. Now, there's also governments, which are different from political systems, states, and regimes. A government is the set of institutions, the actual systems themselves, or individuals legally empowered to make binding decisions for a state. So this is the legislative institution of Iran, which is the Majles, M-A-J-L-E-S. So that's part of the government. And the government's authority is derived from the state's legitimate right to use power to enforce policies and decisions. So this is the Constitution of Mexico, and this gives the government authority and its right to use power to enforce policy and decisions. It outlines how policy can be passed and how it can be enforced. And the right and power to govern itself without outside interference is a crucial aspect of a state's sovereignty. It's probably one of the most important parts of state sovereignty. Without it, you don't have sovereignty. Now let's look at nations. So this isn't a political entity. It's a group of people that have various commonalities, such as race, language, what they speak primarily. Sometimes this is one language or two languages, as well as religion, ethnicity, political identity. Some are more conservative, some are more progressive. And then we have aspirations. So that essentially means, what do these nations expect you to do in life? Do they expect you to marry young, have many kids, have few kids, get jobs? Can women work? What do they want to see in their political systems in the future? And that kind of relates to their political identity as well. Some nations correspond with certain religions. We're looking at a lot of Muslim nations, particularly. So let's look at some examples here. So in Iran and China, there are a variety of different nations that reside there. So in Iran, we have Persians, Azeris, the Kurds, and Arabs. And then in China, we have the Han Chinese, Tibetans, Uyghurs, which I believe are Muslims, and Mongols. And Mongols also live in Mongolia, but they also live in China as well, because they're very, very close together. So, yeah, that's why. And of course, I had to throw in the exception is the Mongols from Crash Course, because it's funny. All right, let's look at Russia. Russia and Nigeria. And I might butcher some of these, so bear with me. So we have Russians, obviously. We have the Tatars and the Chechens in Russia. And the Tatars and the Chechens kind of live in their own little area separately, which creates a lot of, they're called devolutionary pressures for their own autonomy and separation from the Russian national identity. They don't really associate themselves with the Russian national identity at all. And same thing with Nigeria. Nigeria is so diverse in their nationalities, and they all have their very strong distinctions. So we had like the Hausa, the Yoruba, and the Igbo, and many, many more. You should really look up the different nations in Nigeria. In the United Kingdom, these are pretty familiar. We have the English, the Irish, the Scottish, and the Welsh, the four main semi-autonomous regions. And we have Mexico, which is the mestizos, which are native Mexicans that they're the offspring of native Mexicans and Europeans, but nowadays it's just offspring of other mestizos. We have our Afro-Mexicans, so offspring of African and Mexican heritage with the Mayans, and we have the Zapotecs, I believe. I don't know anything about the Zapotecs. The Mayans, they're the Mayans. They're from there. I do want to emphasize something about the United Kingdom. So you may hear from other people on the internet or the news, but see people, well, the country of Scotland. Scotland's not a country. It's not. The United Kingdom is a country, but Scotland is not a country. Same thing with England and Wales and Northern Ireland. Ireland is a country, and we'll discuss that. Ireland itself is a country. Northern Ireland is not a country. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. Ireland is not. And that happened because of religious differences between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But there's still the Irish nation. There's not Northern Irish. So, as I was discussing, these regions reside in autonomous regions. That's what we call them. So we have England, we have Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They have sovereign abilities over themselves to an extent, not full sovereignty, otherwise they would probably be considered countries, because they're overseen by the federal government in London. They have they're unified under similar characteristics, like Northern Irish is Catholic, normal Ireland is particularly Protestant. In Wales, they have the Welsh language, for example. Scottish is also a language in Scotland. And then English, you can say English accents in the English language unify the people of England as well. You could say that the charismatic character of the monarchy also unifies the English people. Charisma, Riz. Charlie has Riz, I guess. Okay. Yeah. Oh, I forgot. I missed one. The Scottish National Party. So political parties can also unify people as well. So in Scotland, the Scottish National Party unifies the nationality of Scotland. Very, very cool. All right, so now we're going to be looking at different types of regimes. So we're going to look at democratic regimes first. And I have the flag of the United Kingdom here. And that kind of signifies that the United Kingdom is a democratic regime. Who'd have thought? So democratic regimes are particularly known for their free, fair, and competitive elections. We have multiple political parties running in these elections. We have multiple people running. Oftentimes we have men and women running. People of different races could run and religions could run. They're also free, so there's not really any corruption. Well, there shouldn't be, but corruption may exist. But for the most part, they're pretty free elections. Your vote matters, and they're fair. So your vote doesn't count for 3 votes, while someone else's vote counts for 1 or 20, for that matter. So United Kingdom here, they have elections as well for their legislator, for the House of Commons, I should emphasize. And this demonstrates that we have competitive elections because we have over 5 political parties that ran. Conservatives, Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, Scottish National Party, and I don't want to get DUP wrong, so I'm not going to guess. So high citizen political participation. Basically, citizens will know that their vote matters and they're gonna vote. They're participating in the political system of government. They're politically aware. They're politically active. The governments themselves are accountable to their actions. If they do something, they're not going to lie about it or try to hide it. They're also transparent. So if they're increasing taxes, they're going to tell you that they're increasing taxes, and they're going to tell you why. They're going to tell you what they're spending the money on. They're going to have public records for you to access. Judicial systems will tell you why they're making their decisions, and if you have a judicial system, particularly at the local level, that you want to appeal your decision, they will stand by their decision, but you can't appeal it. They also have independent branches of government. So the legislature and the executive have their own powers and checks and balances. The judicial system is not just a rubber stamp, a reflection, a mirror of the legislative system. There are differences and checks and balances between them. That's called separation of powers. We also have low state control or influence on the media. So London isn't telling the rest of the United Kingdom what they have to publish in the media, or they have to say it a certain way. We also have what's called due process. So essentially, if you commit a crime, you can be represented in the judicial system. Or if you didn't commit a crime and you're being accused, you can be represented and prove yourself not guilty. And there's also something called rule of law, which is a very, very, very big topic in this course. It's something College Board loves to test people on. So rule of law is that all individuals and institutions are subject to and accountable to law that is fairly applied and enforced, preventing arbitrary use of power and ensuring equality with the law. So essentially, nobody is above the law. The king is not above the law. The prime minister is not above the law. In Mexico, they have a president, so the president is not above the law. If you have the Welsh and the Scottish people, they're both held to the same standard of law. If you have a murder in England but a murder in Ireland, the Irish people can't be sentenced to 10 years just because they're Irish, and the English sentenced to 2 years because they're English. That's not rule of law. Rule of law is everyone's under the same protections, and they're under the same systems of the same legal system, essentially, no matter who you are, and it's fairly applied and enforced. So they're not giving traffic tickets for going 2 miles an hour in London, but they're giving 20 miles an hour in cities in Scotland because they're Scottish. All right, so let's look at some examples of rule of law. I know I gave a ton, but we're just going to look at some specific examples here. So equality before the law, legal transparency. So if you get arrested, they're telling you why you're getting arrested. No arbitrary arrest or detention. So there's a reason. They're not just taking it in because you have a cool mustache that they want to make fun of. Protection of individual rights. So you got the right to live. They're not just going to kill you because they don't like you. Private property rights. You can own a house and you can also defend this private property. So a police officer can't just knock on your door and say, "We want to come in." That's not rule of law. If they just come in, you have right to your private property. Nobody can take your private property without good permission. So like, let's say you commit a murder and they find a murder weapon, they could probably take that, but they can't just take your knives because they're knives. And legal redress. King George III. This is Jonathan Groff, by the way. And then we have government accountability. So they are accountable for their actions. If they make a mistake, they own up to it. And they defend their actions. Checks and balances. I discussed this earlier. If you don't know what this is, essentially this means Actually, I didn't give a definition. Essentially, what this means is that one system of government checks the power of another system of government, typically your branches. So the executive branch checks the power of the legislative branch. And this is to prevent each branch of government from having too much power and dominating the political system. So some examples include presidential veto. So if the president of Nigeria is given a law to sign that was passed by the legislator, they can veto it and say, no, we can't pass this. It wouldn't follow the Constitution, or it wouldn't be supporting the well-being of the country. So they could check the power of the legislator that way. There's also impeachment and removal of the executive. So let's say the president of Nigeria committed treason, for example, or they didn't defend the country against a national threat. The legislator can remove the executive through an impeachment process. The United Kingdom has an impeachment process as well. Russia does. Mexico sort of does. Senate confirmation for president appointments. This is very specific that I'm really looking at in Nigeria, because the United Kingdom doesn't have a Senate. Same thing with Russia and China and Iran. They don't have Senates. But they confirm who can run for president and who's appointed for the president role. These are just examples. So security of tenure for justices. So justices can't be thrown out just because the president disagrees with their ruling. They can keep their job even if the majority of the public disagrees. Or like, let's say there's 11 justices. If 10 of them make a decision and one doesn't, that one person, that one outlier isn't going to be thrown out because of their different decision. Then there's judicial review. So essentially, the judicial system, the Supreme Court can rule a law unconstitutional. So in Nigeria in 2001, they held a case on whether the allocation of oil-producing areas in the states was unfair and unjust. That's an example of judicial review. So we have free, fair, and competitive elections. This is very, very important. So in Mexico, mayors can be elected through direct popular vote. Citizens cast a municipal participant in the electoral process. Citizens have a big role. They vote on these mayors. They also vote for the president and their representatives in Congress. And these elections involve campaigning, voter registration, and a transparent vote counting system. So they can tell you how many votes were counted in each state of Mexico. To vote, you have to be registered. There's processes to become a registered voter in these countries. And then these politicians can campaign for popular support. They're not just going to run and you're not going to know who the heck they are. So this is an example of a mayor or president. I think this is president. No, mayor. I really don't know. I made this PowerPoint over a month ago, so I'll have to look this up. And I'll leave a little comment on the video that you can see right now that says who the heck this person is. So we just covered democratic regimes. They seem pretty cool. We love them. And then we have authoritarian regimes. We don't love them. They're the opposite of democratic regimes. They're not cool. So we have restricted, unfair, and uncompetitive elections. Your vote really doesn't matter. Who cares? The government certainly doesn't. You have limited citizen political participation. Maybe they're not allowed to vote or even say anything bad about the government. We have unaccountable and low transparent governments. So they're like, oh yeah, we had an election. We're not going to tell you how many people got this vote. We're not going to tell you how many votes the winner got, even though they may have gotten only 1 or 2 votes. They may have been the only ones to vote for them. We're not going to tell you that. We're not going to tell you why we passed this law. We're not going to tell you that we did pass this law. You just have to follow a law that you didn't even know about. There's intertwined branches of government. So all 3 branches of government are just rubber stamps of each other. They're basically mirrors of each other. They're dominated by a single party, and they are all best friends with one another. There's no separation of powers. Huge state control or influence on the media. So like in China, for example, they can ban all forms of media. YouTube's banned, for example. That's a form of media. And they can control what's there. There's not really any freedom in what can be published. They have to approve it. They don't like it. Well, it's not going to be available in China. That's for sure. And there's a lack of due process. China has a 99.3% conviction rate. You call that due process? Definitely not. And there's something called rule by law. We discussed rule of law, but now we're going to discuss rule by law. So this is where essentially the governing authority is somehow above the law and has the power to create and execute law where they find it to be just convenient for them, despite the effect it has on larger freedoms that people enjoy. It basically takes away people's freedoms, essentially, which is not cool. So let's look at this. So restricted, unfair, and uncompetitive elections. So the government only permits members of the Chinese Communist Party to take roles in government. The citizens do not vote on these officials at the national level. Local levels, they do have some form of governmental elections, but they really don't do anything. They're not that important. And you have to still be communist. You can't be any other political party. If you disagree, well, you just can't be part of the political system. Let's look at rule by law. So in China, many are forced to reside in concentration camps. So let's look at these reasons. Maybe they like committed murder or something. Political dissent. They disagree with communism. Or traveling abroad. No! God forbid someone travels to a different country. Religion. If you practice religion. So the Uyghurs practicing Ramadan, that will get them in a concentration camp. So that's not very good protection of civil liberties. All right, and we also have unaccountable and low transparent government. So we're looking at the Majles again. And I really recognize pictures of the Majles by that green carpet they have. Wow. It's probably the greenest thing in Iran because it's literally a desert. All right. So vetting of officials into the legislative body in Iran is hardly open and transparent. The decisions made by the Guardian Council regarding the eligibility of these candidates is often not publicly disclosed. So we don't really know what experience they have in politics or what makes them good candidates to be part of the legislative body in Iran. And the criteria used for disqualification may not be clearly outlined. So if you want to run for the legislator in Iran and they refuse, the Guardian Council tells you no, they may not tell you why, which doesn't make any sense. And this lack of transparency can lead to uncertainty and speculation about the reasons behind specific decisions, like why they take this person and not this one. Maybe they like them better, maybe they like their haircut more, or maybe they support their beliefs more. And they have great media control and influence. So RT is an international television network funded by the Russian government. Oh, great. It's also been criticized for pro-Russian government bias and selective reporting. So they're reporting what they want to, what the government essentially wants to report, and in a way that makes the government probably look good. And then this law in Russia essentially means that internet service providers, your ISPs, must store user data and metadata for an extended period and grant security agencies access to this information. So if security agencies in Russia request access to someone's user data on the internet, what they've done, these ISPs have to provide it, which is not that good. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter are required to store Russian user data on servers located within the country, making it easier for the government to access and control this information. Now, what do they need someone's Facebook activity for? I really couldn't tell you. And it can limit the spread of information that is critical to the regime. So if people don't like the regime, they're not going to post it on Facebook or Twitter because they don't want the government coming after them. So look at the types of authoritarian regimes. In this course, there's really only one type of democratic regime: democracy. Great. Excellent. I mean, not really. You could say democracy, but it's democratic democracy, yeah. So we have totalitarian regimes. If you read 1984 by George Orwell, I strongly recommend it if you haven't. This is pretty much a totalitarian regime. These are regimes that seek to control nearly every aspect of public and private life. They tell you who you date, who you can't date, how many kids you can have, where you go work, how much you spend on bread every day, how long you have to wait in line to get bread, that sort of thing. We have one-party systems, which is China, where a single party controls the ruling system, so that's the Communist Party. All other parties are either outlawed or only enjoy limited and controlled participation in elections. In China, they're outlawed. You can really enjoy communism so much better. We have theocracies, which is what Iran is, and this is where governments are essentially following religious guidelines. They have religious leaders who run the government. There is no separation between church or state. That's to say, separation of church and state. And we have military regimes, which is a military rule of government. So in Nigeria, shortly after getting their independence, they became a military regime. So they were authoritarian until they became democratic. And this was accompanied by much political instability and corruption that was dealt with by the military. The military became a very corrupt power when they controlled all these political processes. And they're just now starting to kind of overcome it in a process that we'll discuss later. In 1999, Nigeria transitioned back to civilian rule. Then we have our illiberal, which is also known as hybrid democracies. Now, it has the word democracy, so some may say, like Jerry, that they're not authoritarian. They are authoritarian. They are. So they have certain elements of democratic regimes, like elections, that are present, but they're not conducted in a democratic fashion. So they may not be free or competitive. Liberty and democracy are not necessarily connected. So you may have a freedom to vote, but your vote may not count. or you have to vote for someone. You may be forced to vote for someone. So Putin's super presidency is a very good example of this. So Putin has been president and prime minister and president for like the past 25 years, I think. And that typically shouldn't happen. Russia has term limits for president, but if you become prime minister afterwards, you can become president again. So Putin kind of found a way around this. So people can vote in Russia for other candidates because there's other political parties, but their vote really doesn't matter because Putin is still going to win. And of course, we talk about those restrictions on the media. Media does exist in Russia, and it can be created, but there's so much say that the government has in the media that it's not free. So the Constitution does provide for freedom of speech, a free media, and a constitutional court. But does the court really represent the well-being and rule of law of the people? Not as much. So let's look at this person, for example. Ravil, he was the chairman of the board of Russia's largest private oil company. So this is interesting to note because private oil company means that it wasn't an entity under the national political system. Now, he was found dead after a quote-unquote accidental fall from a hospital window after the oil company criticized Russia's actions and called for an end of the Ukraine invasion. So you can see here they took away, well, we can't really say they did, but someone's civil liberty, their right to live, was taken away magically after they criticized the Russian government. There typically are some kind of separation of powers or a division of powers between our branches of government. The judicial branch has long-term, if not lifetime, judges. Putin appoints the judges, though. Great. Good separation of powers, definitely. And has influence over the key legal bodies, such as the Prosecutor General's Office and the Investigative Committee. So there's more information here that I would love for you to look at. You can scan that barcode. QR code, not barcode. Scan the QR code and learn more about this. All right, let's look at democratization. So democratization is a process that is called democratization. I don't know why I said that, but it's essentially a transition from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. So this process can start or temporarily change direction. So it can start at any time or it can just stop, or reverse itself. And the process aims to result in the following over time. We're looking at democratic characteristics here, as we discussed previously. So Nigeria and Mexico, by the way, are democratizing regimes. There you go. Third time's the charm. So they're not exactly authoritarian regimes, but they're not exactly democratic regimes. They're getting there, though. So we'll see more competitive, fair, and transparent elections. We'll look at increases in participation in policymaking processes. Universal suffrage for all adult citizens, meaning they have the right to vote, and that doesn't discriminate based on race, nationality, religion, gender, that sort of thing. Greater government transparency, protected civil rights and liberties, they're not just killing people because they want to. Equal treatment of citizens, establishment of the rule of law, which kind of goes side and side with this. And yeah, we're going to look at some examples. So let's look at elections in Mexico. So from 1929 to 2071 years, the PRI party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, held uninterrupted power in Mexico. Every single presidential election for 71 years was won by a member of the PRI party. They were overtaken in the presidential election by the National Action Party in the year 2000, and they relinquished their power. So that shows a sign of competition and fair elections in Mexico. That shows a sign of democracy. And then party control has switched back and forth since. So that really emphasizes competition. So in 2018, President Nieto, who was constitutionally prevented from running again, saw his party relinquish control to an opposing party. So they actually have term limits too, which is very interesting. In a lot of places like China, there's no presidential term limits. So that also shows signs of democracy. And when this happened, they relinquished control to an opposing party that had different views from them. And then let's look at the legislature, which has its own elections. They're filled with elected officials who are almost 50-50 in men and women. In some countries, it's only men, and sometimes it's only certain religions. And sometimes, and like in China, it's only certain political parties. And the legislature of Mexico, we have predominantly the PRI and PAN party, the PAN party, the PRI and PAN parties. But there's some other parties as well, minor parties. And then to vote, there is suffrage if you are a citizen, which makes sense, 18 years old, makes sense, or an adult, provide ID, makes sense, and you register beforehand. So these are pretty fair systems to become a registered voter in Mexico. As you can see here, this is a pretty transparent system because we get results on their elections. So this is 2012 and 2018 statistics. We also have like the specific results here. I mean, look at this. We have 4 different people running. That's pretty competitive, which is great. We have 4 or 5 different parties running in 2018, and then 2012 we also had multiple parties running, not just PRI and the PAN party either, which is very interesting and very cool. I mean, look how it's shifted from 2012 to 2018. That's very interesting. That shows a lot of competition, and the fact that the Mexican government provides this information shows a good sign of transparency and accountability in their elections. As you can see here, from 2016 to 2018, voter turnout has increased, so increased political participation. That's a good sign of democracy. So what's the deal? Why is it not a full-fledged, blown democracy? Well, there are some little tidbits of authoritarianism still in Mexico's society, in their political system. So in 2018, there were reports of prepaid gift cards, monedrillos, I believe what they're called, to voters that were given to skew voting behavior. So they kind of gave them this gift card of money. It's like, hey, if you vote for this person, I'll give you this money. And it was a form of vote buying. They're buying the votes. And it was undermining the fairness and integrity of the election. If I pay someone to vote a certain way, that's not going to be a fair election. That's not very democratic. So here's the thing. How would this impact the trust of the citizens? It would not have them trust in the government. And it really wouldn't be a good sign of transparency in the government if the government just lets it happen. And the citizens aren't going to trust the government because they may feel that the election was rigged and that the people running the government do not represent their interests. So Televisa, I think it's Televisa, is one of the largest media conglomerates in Mexico, and there have been concerns about its dominant position in the media landscape because it's very, very popular, very influential, as well as the favorable coverage for certain political figures and opinions. So it has bias. All forms of media have bias. I think my phone was ringing. I don't know. Anyways, all forms of media have some kind of bias. We all know that, but it's definitely notable that they really like discussing certain political figures and systems in a favorable way and others in a unfavorable way. There have also been many concerns over government advertised. That's been heavily depended on by the media outlets. So the media has been advertising certain messages by the government, and that's raised concerns because it's led to a fear of publishing content that's critical to the government because maybe it won't be supported by these certain outlets, or there's so much opposition that it would feel overwhelming. Private media is allowed, but there's also been violence against outlets and journalists that have been very concerning to an extent. Now, there's not really any big evidence that supports the Mexican government directly killed people. There's certainly evidence that shows it, but we can't say for certain because, again, they're not going to come out and say, we killed these journalists. But the correlation exists, and we discussed correlation earlier, and how nice it looks as a form of causation, when oftentimes it's not, and oftentimes it may be, we never know. And then there's drug cartels, very, very important in this course, and very prominent in Mexico. If you watch Breaking Bad, well, you already know. Violence, intimidation of drug cartels strongly influences politics and territory. And if they don't like Canada, they can just kill them. And these affect local communities, political candidates, who runs, because some people don't want to run against the drug cartels, because some people like their lives. Law enforcement agencies, sometimes they won't subdue the drug cartels, or sometimes the drug cartels run the law enforcement, and they're not going to enforce the law. And there's various factors that are affected by them. Local communities may not be safe because of these cartels. They're often going to be violent and erode rule of law. Because oftentimes they're seen as above the law, or at least they treat themselves above the law, and the government responses makes them look like they're above the law. Drug cartels can lead to self-censorship or withdrawal from political participation. So I was talking about political candidates who really don't want to risk their lives by running against the cartels. Some people who speak out against the cartels may face the wrath of their cartels. So in 2014, Mayor Jose Abarca and his wife were accused of cartel association and ordered an attack on 43 students at a teaching college, who then disappeared, possibly headed over to the cartel. That's a good thing for communities. Communities not going to feel safe. And this affects the political candidates because it makes people not trust this candidate at all. And it really erodes the rule of law, because if he and his wife were associated with this cartel, then they're just going to be seen as above the law because they're not going to face punishment for it. So Tamaulipas are located on the U.S.-Mexico border, which is North Mexico and Southwest United States, and it's been a hotspot for cartel-related violence, and that's led to various challenges in law enforcement in suppressing and essentially getting rid of these drug cartels and dealing with them. Infiltration into law enforcement units has led to corruption and comprised efforts. So they kind of worked their way into law enforcement. They bought the way in, or they know other people in there. They've built their way up and become very prominent parts and figures of these northern Mexican law enforcement agencies and units. They've been associated with impunity, with members evading arrest and prosecution. Again, that erodes rule of law, because if they're just avoiding arrest and prosecution, then they're seen as above the law, and that isn't very democratic. Let's look at Nigeria, and we're looking at elections here. So, in the 2015 presidential election, it was a very notable transfer of power between parties. It was the first one that occurred, and this was between the People's Democratic Party, the PDP, and the All Progressives Congress. And these have very opposing views, so they're not like the same, because that would also change something. We see we have other parties as well. If you look at this graph here, we can also see that the number of registered voters has increased. So political participation has relatively increased over time. It's kind of fluctuated a little bit, like 2011, 2015, it went down, but it also went up to a number higher than ever before, to over 80 million people in 2019, which is incredible. And we can see here that the number of votes cast has also decreased over time. And the number of votes cast for certain political parties has changed over time. So that really resembles competitive elections. If people are registering to vote more, they may think, oh, well, my vote counts, so I should register to vote. They're not going to go through any hassle or process to register to vote if they are, one, not going to vote because their vote doesn't count. And they provide various information on election results that demonstrates accountability and transparency. And we can see here, something I want to point out is, what trend do you see here with electoral results? Well, we can see here that the All Progressives Congress is highly concentrated in the north, and the People's Democratic Party is highly concentrated in the south. Very interesting. And there's also no dominant party. That's also something to point out. So let's further discuss this. So it's not the most diverse legislator, not as diverse as like Iran, which is not a democratic regime. But there are no race, ethnic, gender, or religious implications to running. Camels can't run, though. You have to be a person. Running requires an educational qualification, so you can't just, walk in and say, I just finished the 3rd grade. I'm 44 years old. No. You have to have a brain and know how to read to run in Nigeria. To vote, there is a registration process. You have to be a citizen, 18 years of age. You have to have also have a permanent voter card as primary identification. So you have to have an ID to vote in Nigeria. Same as in Mexico. And this ID gets you the photograph of the individual and other identifiable details. And then in 2006, the legislature rejected presidential attempts for a 3rd term. So that shows checks and balances. For one, the legislature checked the power of the executive, because the legislature, it did check the power of the executive because it didn't go for a 3rd term. It also shows the democratic process because they didn't pass a law that would have allowed the president to run for a 3rd term. They could run up to 2 terms currently, not 3, as we can see here from the 2006 incident. So that's a good example of checks and balances. It's a good example that the legislator won't just defend the president willy-dilly. Because if they like the executive enough, yeah, some people like it. They maybe want them to run again because they're doing a satisfactory job in their eyes. But overall, is that a very democratic precedent to have more and more time that the president can run? Will the president be accountable for their actions? I don't know. So what's the deal? Why is Nigeria not a full-blown democratic regime? Why is it still considered authoritarian? Look at them. They didn't even allow their president in 2006 to have a 3rd term. Well, let's look at some examples. So in 2019, in January, the Chief Justice was suspended by the president on the eve of the presidential elections scheduled for February 2019. Very, very, very suspicious. It's giving me Marbury v. Madison vibes. So was there a political motivation? Was there a reason that the Chief Justice was suspended by the president the day before presidential elections? How does this impact judicial independence and separation of powers? Well, it shows little separation of powers. Was it constitutional? Was rule of law followed? Well, if there's more information that we were given, maybe we can determine this. I mean, the president did do it. It did happen. Legislator didn't object to it, so it could be considered constitutional. In 2019, as well, in August, the publisher of Sahara Reporters was arrested under treason, which I'm sure doesn't happen that often, for planning protests against the government. But I'm speaking out against the government in America. That's allowed, but in Nigeria, it's not. Not very democratic to not allow someone to criticize the government. In the run-up to the 2019 elections, there were reports of attacks on journalists covering political events, raising concerns about their safety. And then there's also been security challenges in certain regions, and this is particularly in the northeast region of the country. That's resulted in internal displacement and humanitarian crises. There's been a lot of problems with terrorism in the northeast, particularly Muslim terrorists that have used kidnappings, assassinations, bombings, murders. And the government of Nigeria has been trying to resolve this, particularly with military responses. And this has caused people to be displaced from their homes and also get killed. All right, there's also electoral security forces I want to talk about. So the use of these security forces in the electoral processes are supposed to ensure that when you vote, it's safe, it's peaceful. You're not being influenced by 20 people watching you and knowing who you voted for. You're not feeling pressure, that sort of thing. So there's no intimidation or violence. You're not going to get like slaughtered for voting for a certain party. And it's also to protect election materials. They're not going to rip up different ballots because people voted a certain way or because they are a certain age. It's to prevent tampering, so I can take a ballot and change the vote. It's to prevent that. And it also removes disruptions from voters, candidates, and election officials, or people who maybe want to suppress their voices or their beliefs. Now, what's really happened? And I do want to emphasize that these are considered allegations, but they're widespread allegations, so keep that in mind. So we have security forces being intimidating and violent. That kind of goes against one of their biggest purposes, actually. Direct and indirect interference of election results. So they're impacting who wins, essentially. And they do this by creating environments that favor a particular political party and candidate, so one may feel pressure to vote a certain way. And that shouldn't be the case in these types of environments. You may feel pressure based off of a lot of other factors, like who your friends are voting for, and basically who the candidates, who they believe of the candidates represents their interests the best. That obviously is going to pressure them, but not the environment that they vote in. And it also has been evidence that they've restricted opposition activities and political space for mobilization and campaigning. So they basically say, you can't campaign here, which is not cool. All right, let's talk about a process called democratic paralysis. This isn't really that important in the course, but I thought it was kind of interesting. We'll look at Nigeria some more. There's a QR code if you want to learn more information about this. So a major problem arising from the ethnic and religious diversity in Nigeria, which is a huge thing. Nigeria is so diverse. I can't emphasize this enough. And it's resulted in making it very difficult to find democratic compromise. When you have all these nations with a lot of different belief systems, it's kind of hard to find a point where everyone kind of agrees with something. So these different groups clamor for the scarce resources and for control of the government. They all want representation. They all want to have some kind of control. And they also want to have the resources. That makes sense to me. That's human nature. So that's democratic paralysis. So from the very beginning, political parties in Nigeria were ethnically and regionally based. So I showed you earlier how the parties were very different based off the North and the South. And that's what this is discussing. So the action group is particularly in the West, and it's typically supported by the Yoruba nationality. And if you travel even a few hundred miles in Nigeria, you could pass through as many 10 different ethnic enclaves where natives speak entirely different languages, and they practice entirely different social customs, and they had different political views, and so many other differences in their cultures. So for a democratic political system to survive, citizens must have prior agreements on a set of rules or consensus for the allocation of resources. That's pretty important because resources are important and everyone needs to get them, but not too much, not too little. So it's necessary to have this general agreement. This is what Russia, I don't even know how to pronounce that, called la volonté générale. And this is just the general will. And this concerns certain substantial assumptions underlining the government. So what they can do, what resources they can give, how much resources they give, that sort of thing. So let's talk about this. So in 1999 was Obasanjo's electoral victory, names I can't pronounce. And what he did, he divided federal funds more equally across the 36 states. He called upon the armed forces to quell ethnic disturbances. His cabinet contained at least one member from each state. He's really representing the diverse nature of Nigeria. And he's resolving any of these disturbances and tensions with the armed forces. He also implemented strategic allocation of resources that include medical, educational, and administrative resources. So a variety of them, as well as more. So we have democratization that's provided for freedoms of expression, religion, association. So these cultures can live there in peace and harmony, somewhat. There's still a lot of terrorism. Some Nigerians have used these democratic freedoms as justification for advancing separatist sentiments. So like, oh, we can express distaste towards the government. Great, we want our own country. We want our own autonomy. We really don't have anything to do with the rest of the country. And that's happened quite a bit. Now, what about Russia? What about Russia? Well, it's not democratic. It's authoritarian. It's very authoritarian. Let's discuss that. So Russia is a liberal democracy, not democratizing. Yeah, I said it right. Putin's stronghold in Russia and reports of evident election fraud are not democratic at all. Having different presidents is very democratic. It shows competition in the elections. And reports of election fraud certainly doesn't show free or fair elections. No opposition party also supports that. Putin's part of what's called the United Russia Party, and they've had majority control in the legislature and executive and judicial systems for like the past 25 years. Even though there are elections. There's also restrictions on civil society, which we'll discuss later. So different organizations, they might have to register with the government. And the government doesn't like them, well, they just won't approve them. And those organizations won't take place then. There's also media control and censorship and the lack of rule of law. Some people there may not face the same prosecution that others may. And there's also human rights and freedom concerns, particularly over how Putin exercises certain powers. So, like, invasion of the Ukraine, there's been a lot of concerns over how the people in Ukraine have been affected by that, has killed a lot of people, that sort of thing. Also, the journalists, as we discussed earlier, and then Russian conflict with the minority nations as well. That's pretty prominent. So, Crimea, this happened before Ukraine. The annexation has led to the displacement of Crimean Tatars, the suppression of the opposition, and concerns about property rights and discrimination. So, the right to private property, that's a pretty basic human right. And the right to speak out against someone else, like freedom of speech, which is protected by their constitution, quote unquote, in Russia, that not being protected is a big human rights concern. In the North Caucasus of Russia, there's been counterterrorism by Russian authorities that's led to extrajudicial killings, torture, and disappearances. Particularly against these minority groups that aren't really like Russians that support Putin and are just Russians. These are minority groups that are not considered Russians. They have their own culture and customs and that sort of thing. What about China? That's also not democratic and authoritarian. Sorry, it's not democratic, but it is authoritarian. Yeah, boy, what about China? Well, President Chai, I don't even know how to say his name. I should have looked all this stuff up before. He ended constitutional term limits in 2018 for the presidency, so he can run and be president for as long as he's like, instead of 10 years. No direct elections of government officials. There's no free, fair, competitive elections for these national government officials. Officials are appointed within the Communist Party. They have to be communists. And if they say no to communism, that sucks. They can't be in the political system. They block internet content to limit dissent. They don't want people speaking out against the government or even being exposed to dissent. And they control most media outlets for this reason. There's no transparency in what they do. They do anything because they just want to. They have a very high conviction rate with no appeal. So if you get sent to a concentration camp, well, you're kind of stuck there. And there's been concerns over human rights and freedoms in China as well. Particularly these minority groups, especially the religious groups, they've been known to be placed in these very dangerous concentration camps or just being killed. Yeah. So here's an example. Practitioners in Falun Gong, which is a spiritual movement, have faced persecution since the late 1990s. And then Tibetan activists advocate for autonomy, cultural preservation, and religious freedom. But they face scrutiny and restrictions under the Chinese government for their advocations. China views separatist activities as a threat to national unity, so they try to suppress them with all measures necessary, even if it's violent or it doesn't protect someone's human rights. And then there's Iran. if you've read the news recently, you've probably seen a lot of stuff going on with the women in Iran, a lot of protests and a lot of rebellion against the government and traditional Muslim practices and customs. Very interesting. I really suggest you look into that. So here's an example. Election protests led to the internet being shut down. Not shut down. Let me correct that. To shut down. It's kind of funny. So yeah, so the internet protests were shut down for 6 days in 2019 as a result of mass election protests, and this was ordered by a government body, the Supreme National Security Council. We also have a supreme leader who is the head of state, and they're not elected by the people. They are appointed by a political body. The supreme leader directly and indirectly appoints all the members of the Guardian Council. So technically they appoint one half of the Guardian Council, and then the Chief Justice appoints the other half. So it's kind of indirect, but they're still going to be pretty similar in their patterns of choosing who becomes part of the Guardian Council. They're not going to be very, very different in their manner. And I mean that in the sense that they're going to choose members who are part of the Guardian Council that support Islamic law and the beliefs of the supreme leader and the court system in Iran. The Assembly of Experts are the actual body that appoints the supreme leader, and they're appointed by this Guardian Council. So the supreme leader appoints half the members of the Guardian Council, who then appoints the supreme leader. Very interesting. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps are accountable to the supreme leader, which is a military organization. They're not accountable to any elected officials or institution. Like I said, the supreme leader is not elected by the people. And this Revolutionary Guard Corporation is not accountable to any elected body of the people. It's accountable to the supreme leader. So it's not really representing the interests of the people. So it's not very democratic. So now, how does this impact accountability? Well, the accountability of the this organization here, they're only accountable to the supreme leader. So they're going to do what the supreme leader wants. They're not going to care what the people want. So they're not going to be accountable to the people. Now let's talk about democratic consolidation. This is pretty important. I have this little United Kingdom frog for you because we're talking about the United Kingdom again. So this is the process by which a democratic regime matures. It went through democratization puberty, and it has separation of powers, fair election rules, and strong protection of civil liberties. So we have a lot of rule of law going on. So this makes it very, 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 very unlikely that it will revert back to its authoritarian ways without some big external shock, like a revolution, for example. So the UK is our example for this course, and it's just an example of a democratic process. So in 2010, the Conservative Party won the House of Commons after 13 years of control by the Labour Party. And that means it's not that long, but 13 years is a long time, guys. And an example of rule of law would be the House of Commons directly elected by the which is directly elected by the public, voted against airstrikes in Syria. So they had this military decision they had made, and the legislature voted against it. And then independent judiciaries, these inhibit corruption. So you have an independent judicial system, that's going to inhibit corruption. There's going to be less corruption, and that will inhibit, corruption itself inhibits democratization. So if you get rid of your corruption, you're going to further your democratic processes. And let's get an example of protection of your liberties. So judicial review allows the courts to review the lawfulness of decisions made by public authorities. They don't have a constitution in the United Kingdom, but they still have, common law, common sense law, as I like to call it. So they can't pass a law that says Scottish people have to wear funny hats on Tuesdays. So we look here. Let's look at citizen participation across the states. And so we have our democratic regimes. I'm going to say Great Britain, Mexico, Nigeria are democratic regimes. I have the USA here for just a comparison point. The graph just came with it. I didn't make it. And then we have our authoritarian regimes, Russia, China, and Iran. Now look here. China doesn't even provide any value for voter turnout in the most recent national election, because guess what? They don't have national elections. They also have no values for petitions. Same thing with Iran, because they're not reporting petitions, or they don't allow petitions. If they're not reporting it, well, what does that say about transparency? Well, it doesn't. Interest groups and political parties, that's a sign of political culture. Look at the Great Britain. Their numbers are relatively high for most of them, besides political parties and In interest groups, it's kind of high. They're higher than Russia and China. But petition, politics is not very, it's not very, it's actually the lowest number out of all of them. I didn't even look at that. It's actually the highest in Russia. Very interesting. But they have the highest value for voter turnout and sign-up petition. That's voter turnout's the big one because we really look at these election processes when we're looking at democratization. Interest groups may not be that big in the country. USA, it's a huge deal. So interest groups in like Russia and China, probably not that big of a deal, especially in Nigeria and Iran. I mean, look at that. And yeah, it's still higher than 4 of the countries listed, so it has some emphasis there. So yeah, but look, like you can kind of see here that Iran, Nigeria, those are not consolidated democracies. They're not going to report some values, and they may be lower than others. Like Nigeria has a lower voter turnout for the most recent national election compared to Mexico, Russia, Iran, Great Britain, for example. Take some time to analyze this data and see if there's any other trends you can see. I also want to discuss Freedom of Information Act. So these install processes for citizens to request information, public records from these public authorities and facilities. There are some exemptions. They can't request everything. It also lists obligations that officials have in disclosing public information and being transparent. So this really promotes transparency. And it also promotes accountability because they can show you what they've done. So, United Kingdom, this was passed in 2000. Mexico was passed in 2002. And in Nigeria, this was recently passed in 2011. And this is a great step to democratization and having a democratic regime. And this graph here shows the different political institutions, I believe, of the United Kingdom. And it shows the amount of public records requests that have resulted in a granted request, partially granted. So they didn't get everything they wanted, or just they couldn't get it because it's not available for them to see. Not everything is available. Like I said earlier, a lot of private information. You can't ask for someone's healthcare information, another person's healthcare information. That's private to someone, even though in the United Kingdom they have public healthcare. That information is still private, and that individual is still protected under the law. Now, there's a downside to this. Like I said earlier, you may not be able to get everything, and it may be very, very time-consuming. Governments can be so slow in collecting public records and resources and providing it to the public or individuals, especially if it's something random or something from a long time ago. All right, here we go. Power and authority. So I believe this is topic 1.5 in the course exam description if you're following along with the guided notes. If you're not, that's fine. I'm happy that you're here. So here we go. So power and authority is essentially comes down to how democratic and how authoritarian is a regime. Which of those characteristics is most prominent within a regime and controls who has power, who exercises power, how they exercise power, how is sovereignty used in a country. So democratic regimes can maintain sovereignty using typically less power than authoritarian regimes. Democratic sources of power and authority typically include rule of law. Like I said, that's a huge part of this course where nobody else is above the law. Everyone is held to the same standard in the legal system and is, judged fairly within the judicial system. That's what I was trying to go for. And there's also constitutions. That's a pretty big thing in democratic regimes. Now, Russia has a constitution. Does that mean it's a democratic regime? No, because it has more authoritarian characteristics than democratic characteristics. Particularly that its elections aren't free, fair, and competitive. But for the most part, democratic regimes are characterized by rule of law. That's actually pretty much a requirement to be a democratic regime. And then, for the most part, constitution or some other binding document is present within the political system. Now, in authoritarian regimes, their sources of power come from the military. That's pretty prominent. Religion, if they're a theocracy like Iran, dominant party like in China, and rule by law. As we discussed earlier, that's kind of the opposite of rule of law, and that's where typically like the government or the military are above the law. They're not held to the same standards, and they're treated unfairly compared to the average citizens. Maybe they're not being prosecuted, or if they are getting prosecuted, their punishment isn't as severe as it would have been for a regular citizen. So we're going to look at each of these countries individually, starting with the United Kingdom. So constitutional reforms in the United Kingdom have devolved power to multiple parliaments, and this allows the regime to maintain stability. So a little bit of background information. So the United Kingdom, as we know earlier, is separated into 4 regions: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. As a result of what's called devolution, they have devolved power to parliaments within these regions. So there is a Scottish parliament and an English parliament. There's also a federal parliament. That's very important. And that has allowed the regime to maintain stability because the desires of the people within these specific regions are being met by these regional parliaments. So these are sources of power within each region. So the Wales parliament can't pass a law that's applied to the Scottish entity because the Scottish parliament would have to approve it and pass it themselves. Since 1997, the House of Commons, which is a house in their legislature, has increasingly devolved local governing powers to these regional parliaments. So this is a very contemporary process that the regions are very, very happy with. The power rests entirely, the rest of the power essentially rests entirely in the Prime Minister and then the national parliament. So the House of Commons is part of that national parliament that I was discussing. The Prime Minister, who is their head of government, holds the other power. And the power is kind of fused, as we said earlier, between the Prime Minister and the Parliament. The Parliament actually picks the Prime Minister. The monarch, who is the head of state, has really no decision-making power. We'll learn later that head of state, which is what Charlie essentially is more of a ceremonial role. And they might have some power over foreign policy and diplomatic relations, but that's about it. And the monarchy used to have a lot of power. When I think of the UK monarchy, I sometimes go back to King George III and the American Revolution. And during that time, the king had lots of say in what processes happened in England and colonial America and their other colonized territory. Now, the House of Commons has passed various legislations within the past hundreds of years that have severely limited the power of the monarchy. So traditionally, yeah, they had a lot of power, but nowadays, well, not so much. Now, they do have a constitution. Let's talk about a constitution. Then we'll talk about the UK's constitution. It's a little different. So a constitution in itself is a set of rules and principles established on principles or precedents that a state must abide by. So it's a set of rules based on other rules or principles, like the United States Constitution. There's a set of rules of separation of powers based off the principles of separation of powers that Montesquieu laid out. So that's just an example for you. Now, the UK doesn't have a codified constitution, so it doesn't have one that they written down. They didn't have any founding fathers back in the day that wrote a constitution at a constitutional convention. However, there are various constitutional principles and statutes that the political system, particularly the Supreme Court, abides by, and this is called common law. So we would say the UK has an unwritten constitution. And we have parliamentary sovereignty as the supreme source of law because the parliaments pass the law. And since we have rule of law, the king is under law. So these are examples of these constitutional principles. Rule of law, particularly, is a very prominent one in our democratic regimes. We also have that adult citizens exhibit universal suffrage in elections. I also want to point out, because you may see this on the AP exam, is that these elections are for the legislator. They're not for the prime minister. They're also not for the monarchy. But I think most people know that the monarchy is part of the royal family. And then the Constitution is bound to international law, as Parliament has chosen to increase its practical power in cooperation with other countries via international organizations. So we know that the United Kingdom used to be part of the European Union. That's no longer the case, but there's other organizations that the United Kingdom is a part of. So this unwritten Constitution also applies to the international law and the standards that other countries expect from the United Kingdom as part of their relationships. All right, let's move into China, which is very different from the United Kingdom. I love these memes. All the best memes are the ones that relate to China. So the Chinese Communist Party's control over China's military. So they control China's military. It makes sense, and that's provided power and authority to maintain regime stability. Because essentially, if you got protests and stuff, the Communist Party can just send out the military, and there goes all your protests and your opposition. The Communist Party's Liberation Army won a civil war in 1949 in which this guy, I don't know how to say it, Mao Zedong, sure, emerged as the revolutionary leader of the People's Republic of China. So he was a leader with power and authority, and this was derived from that civil war in 1949. Because typically when someone wins a civil war, they become a very big power holder in the country. Today, the General Secretary of the Communist Party is also designated as the chair of the China's Central Military Commission. So this seat gives them a lot of power because they're head of that military, which, as we said earlier, provides a lot of power and authority to the country. So it's all kind of fusing together. Okay, now let's look into Iran's sources of power and authority. So the transition of power from dictatorial rule in Iran, which used to be the case, I believe it's, till 79, to a religious theocracy based on Islamic law, occurred after a revolution in 1979. I read a book once in 6th grade. It's called It Ain't So Awful Falafel. I guess it's considered historical fiction. It's not a real story, but it's about a family that moved to America from Iran. And while they were living there, they were given all this news about the revolution while they were trying to, assimilate into American life. And they were also hearing all this about their homeland and their family who still lived there. It was a very interesting novel. There was also the religious establishment after this revolution, and then that helps shape public opinion and provides guidance on matters of morality and law. And this occurs because law and morality within the political system and the citizens is based upon Islam. So laws can't be passed if they violate Islamic law. And we call this Sharia law a lot, S-H-A-R-I. I have it up on the screen on the second line here. This is something that you'll see on the AP exam. I might refer to it as that. So it's called Sharia law. And then the supreme leader of Iran, who is not elected by the people, is the highest ranking political and religious authority. I don't know why I have a line break here, but the supreme leader has the final say on major political, military, and foreign policy matters. And this position is held by a cleric who is appointed, not elected, by the Assembly of Experts, which is a body of Islamic scholars. So the supreme leader obviously has to be Muslim, and the Islamic scholars that elect him in the Assembly of Experts are going to definitely make sure of this, make sure he's very well taught and understood of theology, as well as may have some, not experience, but dedication to the role as supreme leader, this political role. So it's a religious and a political role, because they are a cleric, which is very religious, but they also are the highest ranking political official, so that's in a political authority. All right, let's look at the sources of power in Mexico. So Mexico also had a revolution, and this was before 1979. So after the Mexican Revolution, the government created by Mexico's 1917 Constitution was dominated by a single party, and this was the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which is the PRI. I think we discussed it earlier. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, as I said, allowed opposing parties to win some legislative elections. So they weren't as dominant. They're not like the Communist Party where they're like, nope, get out of here. You're stupid. You're dumb. But for the most part, they had control over the political system for about 71 years. The government is the most powerful figure in Mexico's government, and they were, of course, for 71 years part of the PRI party, and they didn't lose a presidential election until a rival party, the National Action Party, came about and won an election in 2000. Now, by 2018, 3 different parties had won power with elected presidents and plus majority control of the national legislature. So even though that the National Action Party won the presidential election in 2000, that doesn't mean that PRI maintained control of the legislature since then. No, there's been various parties that have won majority control of the national legislature since 2000. It's kind of gone back and forth a little bit, so if you want to look into that. And let's look into Nigeria. So after independence from British colonization, which they were colonized as a result of the Berlin Conference, if you're familiar with that, they gained their independence in 1963. Nigeria struggled to consolidate power in democratically elected leaders. They were struggling to be a standalone country, which it makes sense. It's hard going from all this authority from a different source to being out on your own. There's that song in Hamilton, the last King George III song. It's like, you're on your own. No, that's the second song, not the third one. The second song is like, you're on your own. Awesome. Wow. And you're like, you're going to fail. You suck. That's essentially kind of what was happening in Nigeria. They were kind of sucking. They were kind of failing. They weren't doing that good. There were repeated coups, which is kind of just an overthrow of the political system, typically very violent, and they've resulted in 2 extended periods of military rule until the ratification of Nigeria's current constitution. So kind of like Mexico, there was a revolution, not really a revolution, but there was a constitution established after a very more authoritarian side of government. They didn't have coups in Mexico. For this course, I believe Nigeria is the only one with prominent coups that we talk about. So yeah, the first peaceful transfer of power is very, very recent. From one elected president to another occurred in 2007. Nigeria's first peaceful transfer of power from a president of one party to a president of a rival party occurred in 2015. And as we can see here, these are our 2 parties. We had the People's Democratic Party and the All Progressives Congress, I believe is what the party is. And let's look at Russia. So historically, Russia was an autocratic nation ruled by a Tsar. That's no longer the case. In 1919, they turned into a dictatorship under the Communist Party, and that's where the Soviet Union kind of came about. So in 1991, the Soviet Union broke apart, and Russia reemerged as a sovereign nation. However, the years of communist rule did not disappear. They did not just disintegrate because Russia was Russia again. There were some movements towards democratization and democracy in Russia under Boris Yeltsin, particularly with the implementation of the election processes. But when Vladimir Putin became Russia's president in 1999, he kind of took a step back. During that time, there were dozens of parties elected to a very highly fractured national legislature. But within 8 years of his first 2 terms as president, Putin helped create United Russia, which is the dominant party in Russia. It's not the only party in Russia, unlike China, but it's certainly the most prominent one, and really the only one with any political power, for that matter. 3 other parties have consistently won legislative elections since then. Not all of them, some legislative elections. That's pretty important to point out. You don't want to mess with Putin in the United Russia Party. So this is very similar to the PRI's dominance in Mexico. None of these parties have actually rivaled United Russia for power. United Russia is kind of a boot on an ant. So here, I kind of show you what I'm talking about. So, like, this is from, what is this, 2020? Yeah, this is one of their legislative houses in Congress. Let me drink some water real quick. So we can see here that United Russia has a pretty strong hold on this house of the legislature, and the Communist Party still hasn't disintegrated entirely. And we can see here that we have 2 other parties that are kind of in here. 3 other parties, sorry, New People, that's the third one as well. So 3 other parties that are kind of winning those legislative elections, but their representation is very minimal. I mean, 5% is not that much for seats inside of a Congress chamber. And now we're going to look at changes in power and authorities. We talked about the sources. Now we're going to look at the changes and how they've changed over time. We kind of did already, but I made something kind of cool, which I'll show you. So changes in regimes occur when rules and institutions are replaced either incrementally, so that means in stages, or suddenly, all at once, zip, zap, bobbity boo, in which a large portion of the population supports a change in the political system. So when I talk about Nigeria and the coups, the people overthrew the power, essentially. And then the military dictatorship came in, or was already there. Because remember, I said there was 2 extended periods of time. So governments, including political office holders, so your representatives, your presidents, that sort of thing, can be changed more frequently. It's pretty easy to change a government compared to a regime. It's not easy, but it's easier. And this is typically more peaceful, and this is due through like elections. So I could change the government through an election because I can elect someone else. Kind of crazy. We can change the majority party through an election, and we can appoint a different president in the United States, or the United Kingdom can appoint a different prime minister. And there's also lines of succession. So if we have someone die, that line of succession, if the next office holder who's going to become that president is a different party, which never happens, then that government would change. That's not really that frequent, though. Now, governments also can change by more violent means, such as revolutions or coups, and this is particular in Iran and Nigeria. That revolution in 1979 was very, very violent. I strongly recommend looking into it. You don't have to know that much about it for this course. You really don't know anything about it for this course. You just need to know that Iran had a revolution, but it's very interesting. Now, Jerry here says that regimes always transform from authoritarian to democratic, and that is just not true. In this course, they really do. They really only go from authoritarian to democratic. However, they can go from democratic to authoritarian if they put in authoritarian characteristics. So if a country starts having unfair, uncompetitive, unreliable elections, they're transferring back to an authoritarian regime. If the government takes hold of all the media in the country, they're transferring back to an authoritarian regime. If they're restricting your civil rights and civil liberties, that's not democratic. They're going back to authoritarian regime. If they're telling you, oh, you have to buy bread at this date, that's not democratic. If they're telling you you can only visit these websites at a time, or you have to pay to access YouTube or something, that's not democratic. That's very, very, very authoritarian of the government. And like I said earlier, the more that the government does, the more likely it is to be authoritarian, because authoritarian governments typically have more power than a democratic government. Now, here's the really cool thing I was talking about. It is a summary table, and you're welcome. If you want to draw this table, you can. It's really, really helpful, and it really shows the comparisons between these countries, like Mexico, Iran, China, revolutions, Mexico, Iran, China, Nigeria, Russia, constitutions. Now, the United Kingdom has tradition as one, which is because they don't have a constitution. Magna Carta is a document that was created in 1215 that outlines a lot of political principles. And there's other documents since then that have set that common law, as I was talking about earlier, where the legislative and judicial systems kind of follow by in their principles. And we can see here that China's operated by a dominant party. Iran's had the implementation of Sharia law, which is just Muslim law. And Russia's dominated by the United Russia Party. Okay, so we're going to move on to unitary states now. We're going to talk about two different types of states. So unitary states are our first one. So this is where power is centralized at the national level, which is also known as the federal level. And they have more uniform policies across the country. So policy within the whole country is typically going to be the same because the federal government is implementing it to the entire country. And it's going to be potentially more efficient in their policy making and coordination, which is just their enforcement, because you're not going to have local or regional governments to approve of the policy. Once it's passed through the federal legislature and the executive approves it, it's passed across the whole country, typically. So it's very easy to pass more legislation and easier to enforce it because it's the same throughout the country. It's not different. Like in the United States, we're a federal country, so the laws in Georgia are different than that in South Carolina. So it's a little harder to enforce a lot of policy because a lot of laws are different. And I can in here in this picture, we can see that central government is being passed from high to low. That's typically how it works. It's not shared. It won't go from low to high, but it can go from high to low as they implement policy. And this doesn't mean that local governments don't exist. They do exist sometimes, but for the most part, they don't really do anything. So they have single legislative and administrative frameworks that are pretty efficient. As discussed earlier, if you have one body to pass laws instead of two, it's going to be easier to pass those laws. So in this course, our unitary states are China, Iran, and the United Kingdom. Now let's look at our federal states. These are different from unitary states. Federal states divide power. They share that power. It's not just concentrated in the local governments, but it's shared between the central and local governments. And they confer to a degree of local or regional autonomy in supplying typically social and educational services. Oftentimes it's more economic as well as religious in some areas, while also reserving powers for the national government. And I meant religious in like Nigeria, where the North has a lot more Muslim representation in the political system. So Muslim ideologies are going to be in mind more during the policymaking process in those states. Federal power always means it goes from high to low. That's not true. In this case, the power is shared, so it may go from low to high, high to low. It doesn't really matter. In our unitary states, as I discussed previously, it's going to go from high to low if it goes at all. Now, these states are more likely to address the minority and local concerns because those local governments are going to have more power to pass laws that are specific for those regions. So, as I discussed in Nigeria, we're going to have more Muslim ideologies in mind in the political system in the north and more Christian ideologies found in the political system in the south, because the representation is more likely to be Christian. And these are Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia. So I was discussing religious concerns earlier. Other local concerns could be like infrastructure development. So if one state in Mexico has very low amounts of infrastructure that's needed, so they're going to add in more infrastructure to support what's needed. But if another state doesn't need more infrastructure, they don't have to put in more infrastructure. So let's look at some examples here. So both the constitutions of Nigeria and of Mexico establish systems of federalism, that's what we call it, since both guarantee state governments in their respective countries. And they have certain powers. They don't have the exact same powers of the national government. They have certain powers, like collecting a state tax revenue. They do have federal tax revenues in these countries as well. Now, although Russia's constitution establishes federalism with protected powers of regional government, so they exist, they have some protected powers created by the constitution, President Putin and Russia's federal government have centralized powers considerably. So they have kind of stripped away some of these powers and centralized them considerably, so they're more uniform across the country. And this was really influenced about in 2004 after a terrorist attack on school children in the North Caucasus region of Russia. As a result of this attack, the national government strengthened control over security, because that's kind of like a security concern, in Russia's regions, and ended the direct election of the heads of Russia's regional governments. So instead of electing the regional government heads, there's a process now where they appoint these leaders with the approval of the national government. It's not that cool anymore. Not that democratic either. Yeah, power. So the degree to which power is centralized or decentralized in a government can change over time in both federal and unitary states. So in many cases, this reflects a state's response to internal and external actors like terrorism, or ethnic cleavages, or operations of supranational organizations like the European Union and other countries. So requests for autonomy, which is just more power essentially, in regions of the United Kingdom, so Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, has resulted in devolutionary processes. So that's a transfer of power from high to low. So each region has its own parliament, as we discussed earlier, or we call these assemblies, and they have varying degrees of legislative authority. They don't have the exact same as the federal parliament, but they have some own authority over those regions. And this was, I guess we can say, as a result of ethnic cleavages due to desires for more autonomy by the Scottish people, by the Welsh people, and by the Irish people. Now, China has greater economic decentralization, which means their economy is less centralized. Makes sense. And they've had more local economic initiatives. We're looking to unify, but they're more regional-based policies. So we see experimentation in land reform policies and subsidies that will encourage businesses, particularly local businesses, to establish operations in specific regions. Sometimes local businesses, oftentimes those big manufacturing businesses, and they're going to operate in specific regions. Why? Because they can make more money, or they'll be provided subsidies, or land is cheaper, that sort of thing. These initiatives are found typically on the eastern end of China, closer to the coast, because it's easier to export and import goods and services at the coast. Now let's look at Putin a little bit. I reserved a whole slide for Putin because he's just that special. So Putin has used the Russian military to bomb Chechnya to enforce its position as part of the Russian Federation. So this is considered Russian territory, but they have not signed the treaty that joins the Federation. Putin passed a law to remove governors in the republics who do not follow the Russian constitution, essentially, in creating local law. I think that's what I was going to put. Just a typo. So if governors are kind of like, no, we're not going to do this, Putin's like, well, you're out of here. You're fired. Because, if you work for a job and you try to go in your own direction, your boss is going to fire you. That's essentially what's happening here. So in 2020, 7 federal districts were created, and all republics were placed into these districts, and they were run by presidential nominees. Let's talk about drugs, because everyone loves talking about drugs. So Mexico's efforts to combat drug trafficking have involved cooperation with the United States. They've joined various supranational organizations, and one that they're a part of with the United States now has helped with their drug trafficking, because it's also a big problem in the United States. The United States would like to get rid of drug trafficking as well. So hey, let's team up. We'll combat this problem together. So the federal government has sought to centralize security authority. It's not big of a deal that the federal government's getting a lot of involvement in this, and they've utilized the federal police and military in regions with high criminal activity. And this is kind of a map here showing the different drug cartels in Mexico. So not all of Mexico is dominated by drug cartels, but a good bit of it. And it's different cartels too. So different measures to get different cartels, because they're all different in how they act and that sort of thing. So yeah. Federal intervention has involved the suspension of local authorities, taking away that local power, and the appointment of federal officials to oversee security operations, making it a very big deal. Now let's look at resource allocation, which is just the provisioning of resources. So in Mexico, operations under what's known as fiscal federalism have occurred. So the federal government in the 31 states, and they have a federal district, which is Mexico City, they have roles in revenue generation and expenditure. So this system is intended to balance the financial needs of the different levels of government and ensure that resources are allocated efficiently. If you don't really understand what I'm talking about here, what essentially this means is that their fiscal policies in Mexico are kind of based up to the region. So if a region needs to spend more money on infrastructure, they can spend more money on the infrastructure. If a region needs to spend more money on education, they can spend more money on education. It's basing the needs of the region. So the Mexico government is like, you know what? We're just going to increase education spending for the whole region, while some states may not need it. So this is really addressing the needs of the regions. And then, I'm going to try to pronounce this, guys. Ready? The Fondo de Estabilización de los Ingresos de las Entidades Federativas, I don't know, is an equalization fund. It's an economic fund aimed at addressing economic imbalances among the states. Because not all the states are at the same level of development. Their GDPs are not the same. Their economic development is not the same. Their growth is not the same. Some may have been declining at different years, at different times. So this is aimed at making sure that the economic disparities between the states are at a minimum. If states are declining while others are improving, they're going to try to not make the improving ones decline, but they're going to make the ones that are declining improve at a steady rate. In Nigeria, the federal government and the 36 state governments share responsibilities for managing and allocating revenue. I said share because, again, this is a federal system. Power is shared between the federal and state governments. And this is particular with natural resources such as oil. We'll learn more about how Nigeria does oil later, but oil is a pretty big resource in Nigeria. It's a good part of their GDP. So it's very important that there's revenue distributed fairly for oil. So the 13% derivation principle allows oil-producing states, not all of the states are oil-producing, but a good bit of them are, and they receive a percentage of the revenue generated from oil resources in the region. So this means they're guaranteed a cut, which is important. Okay, so we're going to talk about political legitimacy now. Which is a pretty big topic in this course that I really want to emphasize. So legitimacy refers to whether a government's constituents, basically the citizens in our case, believe their government has the right to use power in the way they do. So the people in Russia believe that Russia's government is doing a good job and that they're exercising power the way they should. That's just an example. Legitimacy confers authority on and can increase the power of a regime and government. So if the people in a country believe the government should have more power, they can get more power. And this is very important to not just authoritarian regimes or democratic regimes, but both regimes. So let's look at some sources of legitimacy. So popular elections. I didn't put transitions on these. That's so sad. Anyways, that's fine. Popular elections. So people who are representing the country, the citizens like those representatives for the most part. Some won't, but they elect them, so they're representing the citizens accurately. Constitutional provisions, nationalism, which I gave you a definition for, which is loyalty and devotion to a nation. It's kind of a political term. So the Russian nationality feels loyal and devoted to the Russian political system. Also, tradition is pretty popular in the United Kingdom. Government effectiveness, are they doing their jobs accurately? So if they're passing economic policies, are they doing the jobs they're supposed to? So if I'm putting in a tax system to pay for infrastructure, am I using the taxes to pay for infrastructure? Economic growth, that's a good sign of legitimacy. That it shows that the government is being effective. Their economic policies are working. The economic systems within the government are working, and they're working to increase the economy, because that's always a goal. And then different ideologies. So like Islam is a source of legitimacy in Iran. Everything in the political system revolves around Islam. And as I talk about religious heritage and organizations, sometimes there's different citizen organizations within countries that have been formulated that are serve as sources of legitimacy. And also the endorsement of the dominant political party. We see this with our popular elections. And then if citizens don't like the dominant political party, they can just vote for someone differently. It doesn't have to stay there forever, which in China, that's not the case. And sometimes in Russia, that's also not the case. So how can they maintain legitimacy? So governments maintain legitimacy through a variety of processes or factors, such as political effectiveness, political efficacy. So this means that the citizens trust that their ability to change the government and beliefs, essentially it means that the citizens trust that they can change the government and they can influence political affairs. So I believe that my vote counts. That's political efficacy. There's also tradition, charismatic leadership, Riz, essentially. So authority derives from the charisma of the leader. And then institutionalized laws. That's also pretty important. So these are laws that are kind of... I'll explain it later. I need to give an example for that. So popular elections in the United Kingdom is a big source. So they hold regular elections, including parliamentary and local elections, which contribute to the legitimacy of its government. We also have constitutional provisions with its unwritten constitution, but they have legal documents such as the Magna Carta that provide a basis of legitimacy for its political system. They're not just pulling out their precedents and principles out of thin air. They're not just pulling it out of their butt. The constitutional monarchy is a great example of tradition in the United Kingdom, and then parliamentary democracy has been there for centuries, and that contributes to political tradition. So government effectiveness. So the United Kingdom government is pretty effective in passing policy. It's pretty stable, and that enhances its legitimacy. The citizens believe that, okay, they are doing their governing correctly. And then the citizens in the UK, there's the variety of political parties like the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and these are endorsed by the citizens, and that contributes to political legitimacy and stability, which we'll talk about later. Now, how does the UK sustain this legitimacy? We just talk about the sources. How do they keep that legitimacy? Well, they do it through political effectiveness. So different policies, so especially in addressing economic, social, and public health issues, contribute to the legitimacy of the UK government. So here I provided a picture of the NHS, the National Healthcare Service. They have public healthcare in the United Kingdom that is provided and funded by the federal government. So if the NHS is doing a good job as a healthcare service, they are sustaining their political legitimacy. Political efficacy, so people are trusting in the democratic processes of their elections and other political processes. So the citizens believe that they get influenced by their politics, so their vote counts, and that contributes to political efficacy, which sustains political legitimacy. So also tradition through the constitutional monarchy. And then the Riz of Charlie, his leadership influences the perceptions of the government's legitimacy. If he has good Riz, if people just like his personality, they're going to believe that the UK government is doing a good job as a UK government. And we have our institutional laws. So our federal laws is essentially what these are. I'm not going to give you a big definition for this because you're not going to be asked to define this, I hope. But it essentially relates to created laws at a federal level that are applied across the entire state and are enforced effectively by the government. So they have a legal framework in the United Kingdom and rule of law. That's a big part of it. That these laws have to protect civil rights and civil liberties, and no one's above the law. That supports the legitimacy of the government. Now, we're going to talk about how each of our countries lose legitimacy, because every country in the world, in some shape or form, has lost legitimacy. So Brexit occurred in 2020, officially, and it was the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union. So Brexit brought to the forefront of cultural and social divides from the UK, because it was very, very split on whether the UK should withdraw from the not the United Kingdom. It is the United Kingdom. It was very split over if they should withdraw from the European Union. There were debates over immigration, identity, nationalism, because the European Union had open borders for immigration. Many felt European because they were in the European Union. And this influenced social cohesion, and it raised questions about the inclusivity of the political process. So people who opposed Brexit, they may have not felt included because the UK was withdrawing from the European Union. They thought their opinions were being addressed in the political system. So the economic consequences of Brexit, including uncertainties over how trade would work or the supply chain distributions, because they're no longer that open border agreement. And there's changes in the market dynamics because it would make certain markets harder to reach. This has influenced perceptions on the government's economic legitimacy and the government's support of their economy. Now, both supporters and opponents of Brexit have expressed concerns about the economic implications because the economy really affects everyone. So, yeah, the supporters of Brexit may have supported the event, but they may have also had concerns over how this would affect their economy in the long run. The prolonged and continuous nature of the Brexit process, it took a long time. It took years for this to occur. Of course, it wasn't going to happen overnight, but it definitely took way longer than a lot of people would have hoped. And this is because of challenges in reaching certain agreements, and also because of the protests and the citizens reacting to Brexit. This contributed to a very big decline in public trust in the political institutions, particularly within the Conservative Party. It was kind of seen that the United Kingdom wasn't very competent enough to actually withdraw from it. They didn't have the balls to get out of the European Union and deal with these Brexit-related issues, and that really impacted their legitimacy. Okay, that was just one country. Let's move on to Iran now. So they have religious heritage and organizations, which we should have figured out by now, but they have derived their legitimacy from the Islamic Revolution, and this principle here that I'm not going to pronounce, and this emphasizes the role of religious leaders like the supreme leader. Constitutional provisions for their constitution reflects Shia Islam. They have tradition in Islam that's very ingrained in their Iranian culture and politics. Even before the revolution, they were a very Muslim country. And we have nationalism. The government emphasizes Iranian identity and resistance against external influences. So people who are not Muslim. How do they keep this legitimacy? So they have policy effectiveness. So the perception of effectiveness of their policies, particularly addressing economic challenges, that's one that people in Iran really like. Can be influenced on the legitimacy of the government. Tradition, obviously we talked about the Islamic revolutionary tradition. And then institutionalized laws. So Islamic laws that's passed across the entire country and follows the constitutional framework. Now, how have they lost legitimacy? So in the 2009 Iranian presidential election, there were various allegations of widespread electoral fraud. That's not good, because then the people are going to believe, oh, our vote didn't count. The government is not running effectively, because this shouldn't happen. Electoral fraud should not happen. There was a swift announcement of the results very, very quick. So how did they have time to count all those votes? I don't know. There were discrepancies in reported margins and very limited transparency. They're like, all right, how did you collect the votes? Well, I don't know. Tell us. No. And that's kind of suspicious. All right, we'll have a break real quick. Whew, I'm talking fast. There's also widespread protests as a result. I mean, who would have guessed? And there was millions of citizens questioning the legitimacy of this president's victory. The government's heavy-handed response included a crackdown on the protests, getting rid of this opposition, and they limited the media coverage. They didn't want the media covering all these protests and all this dissent. And this very much affected the political divide in Iran, because some were like, yay, this president won, woohoo! And others like, no, he shouldn't have won. There was fraud. And that really divided the people in Iran. I was looking at Nigeria's sources of legitimacy. So we have a constitutional framework that was passed in 1999. It has respect for the rule of law and constitutional principles that contribute to the legitimacy. Economic development is pretty prominent. There was an oil boom in the 70s that brought more legitimacy to the government in the short term, because the population saw an increase in jobs and economic prosperity. Policies improved the standard of living and reduced poverty, enhanced the government's credibility, because we were like, oh, we're not poor anymore. Our government's doing good. Yay. There's also cultural and social representation. This is particularly due to its federal structure. And this ensures representation and inclusivity of Nigeria's diverse ethnic, religious, and cultural groups that is so important for legitimacy. Policies that promote unity and social cohesion contribute to the government's acceptance. If people believe that their culture and their culture's ideologies and identity are being represented in government, they're going to believe the government's being run well. There's also international relations, so positive engagement in international affairs and adherence to international norms contribute to Nigeria's standing on the global stage. People are like, oh, people in other countries like us. We're doing a good job with the world. Yay! So that creates legitimacy. They're also part of organizations like the United Nations and the African Union. Yeah, and partnership shows that the Nigerian political system gets along well with other countries. So how do they keep this legitimacy? Tradition is a big one, particularly in the federal system, and the diverse cultural heritage. Maintaining all of those cultures is very good at sustaining legitimacy. They're not forcing assimilation on anyone. We also have those institutionalized laws. That's pretty important. With they go by the rule of law, the constitutional principles, the rizz of their charismatic leaders, particularly their presidents, because those are who the people vote for. They don't have a prime minister, and this contributes to the perceived legitimacy of the government. We also have political efficacy, so the people in Nigeria trust that the democratic processes, the elections, and believe that their ability to change political affairs, so they can just elect someone different, enhances political efficacy, and that sustains legitimacy. How has Nigeria lost legitimacy? Look at this picture here. This picture doesn't look good. I mean, that guy's got a gun. Although the elections are overseen by the Independent National Election Commission, the INEC, there have been some irregularities within some past elections, like fraud and voter intimidation. It's like, hey, I'll pass you $5 if you vote. No, it's more like, I'll kill you if you don't vote this way. I guess that makes sense of what that gun's for. So there's been reports of a ballot box stuffing, vote buying, and instances of multiple voting. So multiple voting is just like, I'm going to vote 10 times. I'm going to vote for these dead people. Because they're dead, they can't vote. So allegations of voter intimidation and violence have occurred in certain regions, impacting the ability of citizens to freely express their political choices. Because if they're being intimidated with violence or with $5, they're not going to vote the way that they want to vote. All right, let's look at Russia. So popular elections, they have regular elections. There's been kind of a lot of debates over the fairness and competitiveness of these elections because Putin is still a prominent figure in Russia since 1999. There's constitutional provisions. They do have a constitution that outlines their federal system. There's nationalism. That's pretty big. Economic growth. Russia's recent economic policies and growth in their GDP have contributed to its legitimacy. They have a positive GDP growth rate. So government must be doing something. Maybe. I don't really know. So how do they sustain legitimacy? How do they maintain it? So policy effectiveness, like I said, economic development, national security. We talked about that terrorist attack in 2004 before. And they really cracked down on those security measures. People are like, oh, they're doing something about terrorism. That's good. They're defending our country. That's good. Tradition, their history and strong central governments is actually pretty typical for Russia's history. So if they increase their power, that's following tradition. That's going to increase legitimacy. And then the rizz of Putin, he likes the people of Russia to like him because he probably had no friends in high school. So that contributes to the legitimacy of the government. And as well as institutionalized laws, they have a legal framework that's within the context of their constitution somewhat, and a very centralized political system. Look at that picture of Putin. No wonder the people like him. Now, how has Russia lost legitimacy? Where do I begin? In 2011 to 2012, Russia experienced a series of mass protests and demonstrations following the parliamentary elections. Wide criticism for alleged irregularities occurred. So these include vote rigging and manipulation in favor of the ruling party in Russia. So that's not very fair if they're manipulating the election results. So there were opposing parties that ran, including liberal and anti-Kremlin groups, and they played a pretty big role in organizing and mobilizing the protests. They're the ones that kind of spoke out first against the governments. It is important to note that they felt like they could speak out because a lot of people in some countries, China, definitely will speak out because they don't want to be placed in a concentration camp. Also, they don't want to be arrested or killed. That's a pretty big thing. Most people don't want to be killed. There were riot police that were deployed. That was the government's response to this, and their role was to just kind of disperse the crowd, send everyone home for the night. But there were reports of mass arrests of opposition of these liberal and anti-Kremlin groups that were protesting the government. The government's crackdown of these protests, these very active crackdown of the protests, raised concerns about the freedom of expression in Islamic Russia. People, after they were arrested or they saw that these people were getting arrested, like, whoa, this is a country. We should have the freedom to protest the government. While Putin's like, no. You can't do that. All right, let's look at China now. Yay. So China has had economic growth, and that's contributed to the second largest GDP in the world and the legitimacy, because people are like, oh, money. We're making tons of money. That means China's government, they're doing so good, making us so much money. Government effectiveness, so their ability to implement policies, particularly the economic policies, and maintain social order. Social order is maintained in China. Wow. I wonder why. It's not like people are afraid of their government. There's also nationalism. People support their government for a lot of reasons, and that contributes to unity and strength, because they're all just one big happy family in China. No problems whatsoever. All right, how do they sustain legitimacy? So they just do policy effectiveness. If the people think that their policies are doing their job, particularly generating economic growth and social stability, they're going to have a legitimate government. People in their political system sometimes believe that their contribution to the political change and the societal and economic processes are occurring. There's tradition. In communism, if they maintain communism, they're following the tradition. So their sources of legitimacy include communism, and they follow that tradition, they're sustaining legitimacy. And then the riz of their president contributes to legitimacy of the parliament. He looks like Winnie the Pooh. And we have institutionalized laws that adhere to not different regulations. Well, there are different regulations within the context of a one-party system. So they follow communist ideologies and beliefs. They're not like, in this state, we're going to have fair elections, but in every other one, no. They're unfair. They're so rigged. Now, how does China lose legitimacy? Well, they have a 99.3% conviction rate. Oh, poor Winnie the Pooh. And this has been used by the president to increase punishment of activists who have been protesting, slowing economic growth. No wonder they have social stability. China has faced criticisms for human rights, record, particularly regarding the treatment of activists and dissenting voices. They've had violent dissent, not violent dissent. The dissent hasn't been particularly violent, but their responses have been particularly violent. And they've put people in like concentration camps that are very, very unsafe. So authorities in China have employed a range of measures to suppress dissent, including legal action, censorship, surveillance, and the detention of activists. So basically, if you make a picket sign against the government, you're going to be detained for a long period of time. All right, let's look at Mexico. So they have popular elections from various political offices, including the legislative branch and the executive branch. There are constitutional provisions that were created in 1917, provides a legal framework for the federal republic. They have nationalism with identity and pride in Mexico. People are proud to be Mexican. And they've also had economic growth, just like China. So if the government has made efforts with various economic policies, we talked about fiscal federalism earlier, so the regions can kind of address those specific concerns in their economy to kind of increase their economic growth. So if all the regions are doing this, the overall economic growth of Mexico is going to occur. Mexico has also joined various organizations that used to be part of NAFTA. Now they're part of UMSCA, which is, I think, United States, Mexico, Canadian something agreement. Yeah. Now, how do they maintain this legitimacy? So obviously they have the policy effectiveness policy and economic development and social welfare to the government legitimacy. They also have the citizens' trust that their vote counts, so they can influence the politics and what happens within their country. They want change. Change can happen. There's also tradition, maintaining that history of governance. When the PRI was dominating the political system, that's considered tradition. That maintains legitimacy. But there's also legitimacy in how the elections work, and that they have a president. The president serves a 6-year term, that sort of thing. There's also the riz of their presidents and also their representatives for those regions. And we have institutionalized laws with their legal frameworks and rule of law. Now, how does Mexico lose legitimacy? Well, there's been at least 5,000 people that died in the 1985 earthquake that occurred in Mexico City. And this kind of revealed the effects of PRI corruption and inadequacy to respond to natural disasters. They couldn't do it correctly. And it also shows that they had very inadequate urban planning. They've had decades to build up Mexico City and other parts of the country. And this corruption and mismanagement resulted in a lot of deaths and a lot of infrastructure destruction because of this earthquake, because they didn't plan out these urban areas correctly. So in the aftermath of the earthquake, there were widespread allegations of the corruption that related to the building codes. They were just passing the buildings off without checking building codes and that they were safe when they were being constructed. So many of the class buildings were found to be poorly constructed because they were not following by building codes, and the government just kind of passed them willy-nilly, which is a sign of corruption. And the PRI use just blatant electoral fraud to win the next presidential election, even though so many people didn't trust them. And competition from rival parties increased. I wonder why competition from rival parties increased, because the PRI wasn't looking so good. And these are some pictures from the earthquake. I thought I'd show them to you. This is a lot of destruction. I mean, look how dense the city is. It's incredibly dense. So no wonder there was so much infrastructure construction. They're probably building so much infrastructure at once that they just didn't bother to have the buildings adhere to building codes and safety standards. All right, let's talk about the process of devolution. We talked about this before, but we're going to elaborate a little bit more on it. So this is a delegation of power from high to low government, so national to regional governments. And this has been known to both enhance and weaken political legitimacy. It creates opportunities for and obstacles to resolving social, political, and economic issues by promoting policy innovation, matching policies to local needs. We can improve policies through competition, increase political participation. So, like, if we create a parliament in Scotland, we got to increase political participation by getting some elections for those seats and getting leaders to take the seats of that assembly. It's also checking the central powers. So if you have in a government, a parliament that changes a law that the federal government implemented, we see this in the United States a lot, that they'll kind of invalidate a federal law. They're checking that law and like, no, this is not going to apply here. It also allows better representation of religious, ethnic, and minority groups. So the Welsh people, they're being represented in the Welsh parliament, that sort of thing. The people in southern Mexico, their regional governments are representing them well because the north is way more populated. It'll have a lot of say in their federal elections. Now, it can also create contradictory policies, potentially making policy implementation more complicated and inefficient. It allows inequality between regions, so they got different tax rates in different regions of Nigeria. That's very unequal, and it can result in economic disparities in their growth and economic development. It also increased competition for resources. Resources may not be allocated the same, so it's kind of first come, first serve. Who's going to get them first? Who's going to get them effectively? So, yeah. And it also create more ethnic and local tensions. Let's say you have 3 minority groups in a region under one government. Well, there's tensions being created there. More competition over reaching those seats in the legislature. So the UK is our main focus for devolution in this course. Scotland's a big one, particularly. So they've introduced innovative policies such as free university tuition. And in England, there are tuition fees that are charged. So that's very different. Devolution allows for the representation of distinct cultural and linguistic groups, such as the Welsh and the Gaelic-speaking communities, that ensure their interests are considered in those regional policies, which may not be considered in the federal policy-making processes. And then there's also been historical and cultural differences in Northern Ireland from the rest of the country that have influenced the devolved governments and at times become a source of tension. When Northern Ireland and Ireland were having a lot of religious differences, that resulted in devolution of Ireland becoming its own country. And that resulted in a Northern Ireland government. It did result in more of a Northern Ireland government that was very distinct, as well as a very distinct Irish government in Ireland. Look at this sign here. That's Welsh. It's so long. I've seen a lot of really long Welsh terms. It's crazy. All right, let's talk about political stability. This is the last topic for this unit. This has been such a long lecture. I just cracked my elbow. Oh my gosh. So political stability is a situation that's characterized by the preservation of an intact and smoothly functioning government. So the political government isn't just like going crazy. They have a system in place. They're following their systems. Their laws make sense. They're avoiding disruptions or very big changes over an extended duration. So there are various factors that we need to know about that affect political stability, such as combating corruption. Corruption makes a very unstable government. State responses to separatist group violence. So those are groups that want to either separate from the country, like the Irish did in the UK. The Ireland became its own country because of this. There's also drug trafficking, particularly in Mexico, and discrimination based on gender and religious differences. Iran's a big focus for this, but they've also combated this to increase the political stability. Then there's state responses to protest movements that oppose government policies. Then we have Jerry here saying legitimacy and stability are the same thing. No, they're not. Legitimacy revolves around the people's perception that the government is running the way that it should, and political stability means that the government it's pretty smooth, it's intact, it's not falling apart, that sort of thing. So let's talk about corruption. So in the United Kingdom, Mexico, Nigeria, they've all attempted to address and reduce corruption, and they pass Freedom of Information Acts to kind of show what's going on within the government. That's very, very transparent. And they allow particularly journalists to report on what's happening in the government using this government information, and they can be critics of the government. That's also very important, that they can report in opposition to the government. Now, in China, that doesn't happen. In China, their president has used courts and corruption to punish like 1,000 different government officials from rival factions within the Communist Party. And in Iran, the media and internet are controlled by such a government. Same thing with China, and particularly Russia. So it's very difficult to criticize or combat political corruption when there's not really any real outlets to do that and to question the government and say, they suck, they're wrong, look what they did. Now let's look at separatist group violence, drug trafficking, and discrimination after I drink some water real quick. So Iran's constitution mandates that there's a few seats in the national legislature, the majlis, for candidates that are Christians and Jewish. So it's not just Muslim. They also allow women to be in the majlis. Very interesting. Now, they allow women to vote as well, and they have allowed them to be licensed drivers long before many other countries in the Middle East. But they still draw many critics that discuss their human rights activists but they do discuss human rights against gender discrimination policies. And we're going to talk about a lot of these, like how women couldn't get an education or go to sports games, that sort of thing. So soccer events, male soccer events in particular, at Iranian stadiums, there's been a lot of governmental rules about women. They can't attend these events. And over time, that's kind of declined, but it's still something that we should talk about. And since 2006, Mexico's national and local governments have struggled to reduce high-profile violence caused by drug cartels that undermines the rule of law. Because if they can't get rid of these drug cartels, then people are like, oh, well, they're above the law. No, they're not technically above the law, but they're having a hard time enforcing the law with these cartels. They're so prominent. In 2018, they had 33,000 murders, which was a 33% increase from 2017. And these can be traced to cartels. And in 2014, there was mass kidnapping and murders of more than 40 college students in Iguala. Mexico revealed collusion between the local government and the drug cartels. So that's a sign of corruption, actually, and the local governments are being run by the cartels. And that's a sign of rule by law because they're not being withheld to the same legal standards as the rest of the citizens. It also took away the civil liberties of the people, the right to live. So mass protests have taken place against national government officials for not addressing the corruption and crime of local governments working with drug cartels in response to this kidnapping and mass murders in Iguala. So this shows a really big sign of political instability because these local governments, they're not adhering to rule of law. They're not very smooth. There's a lot of shady stuff going on here, and the people are protesting because the political government isn't stable or legitimate for that matter because of that. So instability related to significant domestic violence is reflected in a relatively high fragile state index scores. It's coming back. Mexico and Nigeria as compared to the UK. So they're more fragile in compared to the UK, despite them being considered more democratic regimes. So in Nigeria, they have a terrorist group called Boko Haram. It's a Muslim terrorist group, and it takes place to essentially limit political and social activity associated with the Western society. They want to preserve Muslim culture and ideologies within society and political processes within Nigeria. Now, not all of Nigeria is Muslim. The South is particularly Christian. The North is particularly Muslim. So this terrorism has been attempting to take control of the federal government and the rest of Nigeria to make it a theocratic state. So yeah, now they've also tried to make northern Nigeria itself a theocratic state because that's probably easier to do, and they've utilized bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations to really increase that domestic violence and instability of the political system. The president has coordinated military attacks against the terrorist group, but they haven't really been able to eliminate this terrorist threat. So that doesn't show a good sign of stability within the government and effectiveness in responding to this terrorism of this Muslim group. And also about protest groups that oppose government processes and policies or their equal enforcement. So in 1989, this is a big one. The Tiananmen Square protest movement in China started with students, Chinese students, calling for democratic reforms. They were kind of tired of this authoritarian communist stuff that there was going on in China. So they were particularly responding to the government's movement towards neoliberal economic reforms in some of the economic sectors. As the size of the protests grew, because people started to like it, factions within the Communist Party opposed these democratic reforms. I mean, why wouldn't they? And so they violently suppressed the protests to stop other people from speaking out. It resulted in a death toll that ranges from 300 to 10,000. And it's known as by many Chinese as the June 4th incident. Now, why is it considered the 300 to 10,000 range? That's a pretty big range, a pretty big difference. 300 dying is a lot less than 10,000. Well, that's because any discussions of the explanation is coming shortly, but any discussions of democratic policy reforms in China were halted, and the CCP Politburo members who supported the protests were removed from power. Here we go. China's current leadership denies that the protests even occurred. They say, no, this didn't happen. Fake news. And there was also a crackdown on the internet in China after this. So if you live in China, you cannot find anything on the internet that relates to this event, the June 4th incident, this 1989 Tiananmen Square protest. So yeah. Let's look at Iran. So there's been mass protest that's called the Green Movement against electoral fraud in that 2009 election. Iran's government swept the opposition, swept the protesters and the rival political leaders, and they increased their monitoring of the internet significantly to counter the protests in support of the government. Later on, the government actually shut down the internet for 6 days. I believe this was in 2019, following the protests. And I think this is what this graph shows. It shows that activity because they shut down the internet for 6 days because of how much dissent there was. That's a very big sign of authoritarianism and political instability. So yeah, we also had electoral fraud protests in Russia in 2011-2012 that led to the arrest of many leaders and very violent confrontations with the security personnel. They allowed counter-protesters, so government security forces allowed counter-protesters in support of the government to attack these opponents. They're kind of like, yeah, they're protesting against us. Go get them, suck them. That's essentially what they were doing. With these opposers of the government. And they've passed laws to suppress the criticism of the government and organization of protests with the internet. So Russia is having a lot more control on the internet and the media to silence this dissent. All right, let's talk about economic growth. So state authorities of different regime types have attempted to limit various actors in their countries and influencing their economics, because they want to attract private capital and foreign direct investment to improve their economic growth. So instability to reduce crime related to drug cartels can diminish political legitimacy and stability, as well as impact the vital economic industries, because maybe businesses don't want to operate in areas where there's cartels, or even the industries are being operated by the cartels themselves, or the cartels are such a big part of the economy that it's not reported accurately in their GDP. So Mexico's tourism centers have grown increasingly worried that crime related to drug cartels will reduce visits by foreigners, because foreigners don't want to be somewhere where there's cartel violence and cartel prominence. So those tourist areas, particularly in the north, are kind of worried that their funds and their profits are going to decline because of this drug cartel prominence. They've increasingly attacked the gas and oil lines to steal fuel. So they're stealing fuel. That fuel can't be sold to other countries to make money in Mexico. All right, so that was the end of the unit. Good job, you made it through. So this is the kind of stuff we went through. We went through the practice of political scientists. We discussed different ways they measure political data. Went through political organizations, so governments, regimes, states, nations, that sort of thing. Went through the differences between democracy and authoritarianism. We went through the process of democratization, democratic paralysis, and democratic consolidation. We went through the sources and changes of power and authority for our 6 core countries, and the difference between federal and unitary system. We also went through political legitimacy, how it's created, how it's sustained, and how it's lost, as well as political stability, how it's sustained, how it's sustained, created, and lost, and that sort of thing. There are practice tests. I've said this earlier in the description down below. If you would like to practice your Unit 1 skills, they're very, very helpful in my opinion. And yeah, so that's cool. So thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out. If you have any questions at all, please leave a comment. I will be glad to respond to your comments. If any of the links aren't working, just let me know as well. Please subscribe, like, that sort of thing. I already said that. It really does help me out. I'll see you guys in the next video. Adios.